Welcome to the True Crime for Sleeping channel. Here we tell the stories that linger long after the headlines fade, where quiet crimes hide in plain sight, and the truth moves slowly, like shadows stretching across a dimly lit street. Tonight, settle in as we explore the haunting unraveling of a family and a community forever changed by betrayal. This is the story of what really happened on Applegate Lane. It began the way so many tragic stories do, in a place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. The town of Maple Hollow, Indiana, wasn't the kind of place that made the news. It was a town of wide front porches, seasonal block parties, and neighbors who still waved when they passed each other on early morning walks. Tucked among its quiet cul-de-sacs was Applegate Lane, a short, winding street with modest brick homes, trimmed hedges, and the faint scent of jasmine that lingered through the spring. At number 712, in a well-maintained ranch-style house with shutters painted hunter green, lived the Whitaker family. From the outside, the Whitakers appeared almost enviable in their normalcy. Catherine Whitaker was a retired elementary school librarian, soft-spoken, gentle, known for giving away batches of homemade lemon bread each winter. Her husband, Harold, had spent decades working for the county utilities office before retiring early due to back issues. He was the quieter of the two, often found working in the garage or watering the rose bushes out front. Their only child, Marcus, had returned to live with them the year before. He was 34, newly divorced, and had taken up residence in the basement apartment while he got back on his feet, as the neighbors put it. Marcus was polite, though less social than his parents. He sometimes waved to neighbors, but rarely stopped to chat. A loner, most said, but harmless. If you'd driven by the Whitaker home in the spring of 2017, you'd likely have seen Catherine tending her flower beds while Harold read the paper under the awning. You might have seen Marcus unloading groceries or pulling weeds near the mailbox, and you would have driven on without a second thought, because the house on Applegate Lane didn't look like the kind of place where anything went wrong. But behind the curtained windows, something was beginning to unravel. It began with small things. Catherine stopped showing up to her weekly knitting circle. Harold, who normally picked up the mail with near-religious precision at 10 a.m., hadn't been seen on his usual walk in over a week. A neighbor, Mary Klein, noticed the trash cans hadn't been brought out on Tuesday. Another neighbor saw Marcus sitting in his car, engine running, staring ahead without moving for nearly 20 minutes. On the morning of April 28, 2017, Mary Klein, who had been Catherine's friend for nearly 40 years, walked across the street with a Tupperware of blueberry muffins and knocked on the front door. No answer. She waited, then rang the bell again. Still nothing. That's when she noticed the mail slot was overflowing. A sense of dread crept in. She walked around to the side of the house and peered through the kitchen window. The dishes were stacked high, untouched. A light in the hallway flickered faintly, even in daylight. The house felt still, but not peaceful. Mary called the police. When the officers arrived, they knocked 3 times and then entered the house with caution. Inside, they found an eerie silence. No struggle, no broken glass. Just a stillness that felt unnatural. Upstairs, the kitchen was cluttered, but not ransacked. In the living room, Harold's reading glasses sat on the coffee table. Catherine's half-finished scarf was folded neatly on the arm of the couch. It was the basement that held the first signs of something being wrong. When officers descended the narrow staircase to Marcus's living space, they found the door closed and locked. After calling out and receiving no answer, they forced entry. Marcus Whitaker was inside. He was lying on the floor, semi-conscious, a bottle of prescription pills spilled nearby. On the nightstand was a short handwritten note. "I'm sorry, I had to make them quiet." Paramedics were called immediately. Marcus was rushed to the local hospital, his condition critical but not fatal. Back at the house, officers began a room-by-room search. They didn't have to search far. In the master bedroom, covered neatly with the floral comforter Catherine had bought years earlier, lay the bodies of Catherine and Harold Whitaker. They appeared peaceful at first glance, No sign of struggle, no sign of forced entry or assault. But closer inspection revealed a chilling truth. Both had been smothered in their sleep, most likely with a pillow. The scene was almost too calm, almost staged. What had happened in that house? The community reeled as news of the discovery spread. Police held a brief press conference the following morning, confirming the deaths but withholding details pending investigation. Neighbors were stunned. Candlelight vigils were held on the sidewalk in front of 712 Applegate Lane. Bouquets of flowers piled up on the porch steps. People cried not just for the victims, but for the loss of something intangible, the illusion of safety, perhaps. The belief that bad things happened somewhere else. Marcus, still recovering at the hospital, was placed under police watch. His note was vague but damning. And yet, investigators were cautious. They needed to know more. Detectives began retracing the Whitakers' final days. Interviews revealed that Catherine had expressed concern about Marcus's behavior. He'd been withdrawn, erratic, sometimes pacing for hours in the basement, other times sleeping all day. He'd lost 2 jobs in 6 months. Catherine had told one friend she feared he might be depressed. Another recalled Catherine saying Marcus had been different since the divorce, angrier, more volatile, but unwilling to seek help. Harold had been more private. A man of few words, he rarely discussed family matters. But in a conversation with a neighbor just a few weeks before his death, he had mentioned something strange. He said he was worried Marcus was hearing voices, the neighbor recounted. But then he brushed it off, said he was probably just overtired. I think he didn't want to believe anything was really wrong. As detectives gathered evidence, a picture began to form, not of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man unraveling under the weight of untreated mental illness, isolation, and shame. Still, nothing could explain the crime. In his hospital bed, under sedation and police watch, Marcus awoke 2 days later. He seemed disoriented, confused. When asked about the note, he stared at the ceiling for a long time. I didn't mean to hurt them, he eventually whispered. They kept looking at me like I was broken. I just wanted it to stop. It wasn't a confession, it was more like a cry from a place too deep for reason to reach. That same day, Marcus was formally arrested for the murders of Catherine and Harold Whitaker. The house on Applegate Lane was sealed off, and the forensics team worked through the night. They found no signs of a break-in, no other DNA. Everything pointed inward, to Marcus, to the note, to the pills, to the quiet finality of the bedroom upstairs. But the deeper truth, that slow aching truth, was more complex. Why had Marcus broken? Could anyone have helped him before it reached this point? How did a family that once shared meals and birthday candles fall so silently into tragedy? There were no easy answers. Only the sound of a screen door creaking in the breeze, the whisper of wind through empty branches, and a house that once stood for stability now standing as a monument to sorrow. Wow. Marcus Whitaker's arrest didn't send shockwaves through Maple Hollow in the way one might expect after such a violent crime. There was no hysteria, no frenzy outside the courthouse. Instead, what blanketed the town was something quieter and heavier. Grief settled in like a low fog, persistent and hard to see through. For many, Marcus wasn't a stranger. He had grown up on Applegate Lane, riding his bicycle down the sidewalks, attending community barbecues, passing out candy on Halloween. His fall from grace was not dramatic, it was disorienting. What troubled people most was how ordinary everything had seemed. In the days that followed his arrest, Marcus remained mostly silent. At his arraignment, he appeared thin and subdued. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't respond when his name was read. His public defender entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf, pending a psychiatric evaluation. Outside the courthouse, a local reporter stood beneath a tree scribbling notes. Why? The headline in the Maple Hollow Chronicle read the next morning. It wasn't accusatory. It was baffled. Why had Marcus killed his parents? 2 people who had by all accounts loved him deeply. What had built up inside him, unspoken, until it spilled over into something irreversible? Detectives began interviewing friends, relatives and former co-workers, piecing together Marcus's recent years like a puzzle with missing edges. What emerged was a story less about anger and more about descent into isolation, instability, and finally, madness. After his divorce in 2015, Marcus had lost his footing. His ex-wife, Jenna, described him as someone who had always struggled to express emotion, but had grown increasingly withdrawn in the final year of their marriage. He wasn't violent, she told investigators. Just gone, like he was drifting away and didn't know how to come back. After the divorce, Marcus moved into a small apartment outside Indianapolis, working for a tech logistics firm, but the job didn't last. He was let go for repeated absences and what co-workers called strange behavior, muttering to himself, zoning out in meetings, once going missing for an entire afternoon before being found asleep in his car. By late 2016, he had moved back to Maple Hollow and into his parents' basement. According to records, Catherine and Harold welcomed him with open arms. They paid off his credit card debt, helped him buy new clothes, and even encouraged him to take night classes in data entry. But Marcus never enrolled. Instead, he spent his days holed up in the basement, sometimes sleeping for 14 hours, other times pacing until dawn. Neighbors occasionally heard him shouting late at night, though they couldn't make out the words. The Whitakers, for their part, kept up appearances. At church, Catherine still smiled. Harold still nodded politely at neighbors. But their visits to friends became less frequent. Catherine skipped her knitting circle. Harold missed 2 appointments with his cardiologist, something he had never done before. A journal recovered from Catherine's nightstand revealed growing concern. "He's not the same boy." One entry read, "I love him, but I feel like I don't know him anymore. Harold says it's just a phase, but I'm afraid it's more. Sometimes I catch him talking to the walls." Another entry, dated just a month before the murders, was more ominous. "He said something strange last night. He told me he hears things in the attic, but there's nothing there. I told him to see a doctor, but he shut down. I don't think he wants help. I'm scared we waited too long." Despite the warning signs, there had been no official intervention. No one had called Adult Protective Services. There were no police reports. Catherine and Harold, like so many families, had hoped love and time would be enough. But Marcus was slipping. The psychiatric evaluation ordered after his arrest revealed what no one had been willing to face. Marcus suffered from severe untreated schizophrenia, likely undiagnosed for years. His delusions centered around a belief that his parents were no longer who they claimed to be, that they had been replaced, he claimed, by imposters sent to monitor him. According to the state-appointed psychologist, Marcus described waking up one morning and being certain that the people upstairs were not his mother and father. He believed they were mimicking their voices, wearing their clothes, but that underneath, they were something else, something malevolent. He was terrified, the psychologist wrote. His crime was not one of malice, but of psychotic desperation. He believed he was acting in self-defense. The district attorney faced an agonizing decision. There was no question that Marcus had committed the crime. The evidence was overwhelming. The note, the lack of forced entry, the timeline, everything pointed to him. But what Marcus lacked was intent in the legal sense. He was not sane at the time of the murders. The DA chose not to seek a traditional murder trial. Instead, the court held a competency hearing to determine whether Marcus could understand the proceedings against him. After several weeks of psychiatric observation, he was ruled incompetent to stand trial and committed to a state mental hospital for long-term care. For the town of Maple Hollow, it was a strange form of justice, neither satisfying nor cruel. There was no trial, no sentencing, no cathartic moment in court. Just a slow, quiet fade from the public eye. The house on Applegate Lane remained empty for over a year. The grass grew tall. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. For sale signs went up and came down. No one seemed eager to buy it. Eventually, it was purchased by a couple from out of town, who had no idea what had happened there. They gutted the interior, repainted the shutters, and planted new roses. But the neighbors never forgot. Mary Klein, who had been Catherine's closest friend, would often pause on her walks to look at the house. She'd remember the smell of lemon bread in the winter, the sound of laughter through open windows in the summer, and she'd feel once again that old ache, a question with no satisfying answer. Why didn't anyone see how far Marcus had fallen? Why did Catherine and Harold suffer in silence? Was there a moment, a single hour or day, when intervention might have saved them all? Those questions would linger like ghosts, refusing to settle. The tragedy of the Whittaker family wasn't in how they died, but in how their suffering hid behind the walls of a house so ordinary, no one thought to look inside. Marcus remained at the state hospital for years, never showing signs of recovery. He lived in a world of confusion and fragments, where time had folded in on itself, and nothing made sense. Staff described him as quiet, compliant, sometimes frightened. He never spoke of that night again. And maybe that's for the best, because some truths aren't meant to be dissected. Some tragedies, like the one on Applegate Lane, remain suspended in that terrible stillness, just out of reach, but never quite forgotten. The seasons turned without ceremony in Maple Hollow. By the time Marcus Whittaker had spent 2 full years at the Fort Lethem State Psychiatric Facility, the town had learned to speak his name less, not out of cruelty, but as a way to reclaim normalcy. Children played again on Applegate Lane, though never near the old Whittaker house, even with its new coats of paint and friendly porch lantern. People walked their dogs a little faster past it. Sometimes they'd glance at the upper bedroom window out of habit, half expecting a face to appear. The local paper never ran a follow-up. No exposé, no retrospective. The community preferred the comfort of silence. But in the quieter corners, among the town's older residents, the ones who remembered Catherine's baking or Harold's deep laugh at potluck dinners, the memory still lived. For Mary Klein, it played like a recurring song she couldn't turn off. Some nights she'd wake up with the strangest sensation, like she had forgotten something vital about that family, something buried in those final months before the murders. One rainy October evening, Mary sat at her kitchen table, thumbing through a weathered photo album. There was a Polaroid of the church picnic in 1998. Catherine, laughing, Marcus maybe 12 years old, his bowl-cut hair stiff from the breeze. There was Harold at the grill, tongs in hand, slightly sunburned. They had looked like any other family, but memories, she'd come to understand, were not fixed things. They shifted with hindsight. Suddenly Marcus's shy posture seemed different, withdrawn, not bashful. His faraway look no longer read as dreamy, but perhaps disoriented. Had there been signs even then? Was the foundation of his illness visible long before it broke the surface? In Fort Lethem, Marcus was a ghost inside his own skin. He kept to himself. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was usually fragments. The watchers, he muttered once, staring into the fluorescent light overhead. Another time, he whispered to the orderlies that the trees outside had names. When asked who they were, he replied, "They keep the others out." His psychiatrist, Dr. Lynette Greaves, kept meticulous notes. She had worked with dozens of patients suffering from schizophrenia, but Marcus presented a particularly cruel version. His paranoia remained persistent, even under antipsychotic treatment, and the most effective medications left him lethargic, unable to participate in therapy. Still, she continued the sessions. She asked about his parents. On rare occasions, Marcus would talk about them. "My mother sang when she did the dishes," he said one day. Sometimes hymns. Sometimes she'd make up her own. Dr. Greaves nodded gently, encouraging him. "She made soup when I was sick," he added. "Carrot. I hated it. She always said it was good for my stomach." He paused. "But she wasn't my mother at the end," he said flatly. "She wore her face, but she wasn't her." "How do you mean?" She moved wrong, like she was copying a memory. Dr. Greaves wrote it down carefully. Delusion or metaphor? In Marcus's world, the difference was often blurred. He never showed remorse in the conventional sense. There were no tears, no pleas for forgiveness, but he would often ask one question during their sessions: did I make it stop? When Dr. Greaves pressed him on what it was, he'd fall silent. Meanwhile, the Whittaker estate remained in limbo, with no living heirs, and Marcus legally deemed incompetent. A public trust was established. The funds, most of them tied up in the modest house and small savings account, sat untouched. Until one spring, a letter arrived at the county clerk's office. It was from a woman named Rebecca Dunn, living in a small town in Maine. She claimed to be Marcus's half-sister. The letter contained only a short explanation. Her mother, now deceased, had had a brief relationship with Harold Whittaker before his marriage to Catherine. She had known nothing of her father until she was in her 30s and stumbled upon a box of letters among her mother's belongings. For years, she had debated reaching out, always fearing the disruption it might cause. When she finally worked up the courage to write Marcus, she discovered the news. Her father was dead, and her half-brother institutionalized. The town barely noticed the proceedings that followed. Legal representation was appointed to verify Rebecca's claim. DNA testing was quietly conducted. It confirmed the relationship. Still, she wasn't seeking inheritance. She insisted. Instead, she wanted to visit Marcus. Not to ask why. She knew enough to understand that she would likely never receive a clear answer, but to offer what little family he had left. After some hesitation, the hospital granted the request under supervision. Rebecca's visit didn't resemble the emotional reunions shown in movies. She didn't embrace him. Marcus didn't cry. He stared at her, puzzled, as if trying to remember a dream. "You look like him," he murmured after a long silence. Rebecca's voice trembled. "They said I do." He nodded, then stared out the window. They sat that way for an hour. She came back 2 more times over the next 6 months. On the last visit, she brought him a sweater she had knitted, a muted green, soft at the sleeves. Marcus accepted it without expression, but when she left the room, one of the orderlies swore they saw him hold it to his face. Dr. Greaves noted a slight shift in behavior in the following weeks. Marcus seemed less agitated, slept better. He began humming to himself, simple tuneless sounds, but a rhythm all the same. It wasn't recovery, it wasn't closure, but it was something. Back in Maple Hollow, Mary Klein stood in front of the old Whittaker house one early evening. She carried a small bouquet of daisies from her garden and laid them gently by the mailbox. She didn't say a prayer. She didn't cry. She just stood there, remembering Catherine's voice calling to her across the fence, remembering Harold's big laugh, remembering the boy with quiet eyes, who always seemed somewhere else. And for a moment in the golden hush before nightfall, the house looked warm again. Not haunted, not cursed, just still. Marcus remained at Fort Lethem, his days steady and muted. Rebecca continued to write letters, though she never knew if he read them. Sometimes, she'd send crossword puzzles, or short poems. Once, she mailed a cassette tape of her playing the piano, soft wandering notes that filled his small room, when the nurse played it through an old tape deck. They never spoke of the murders, not once. Perhaps that was the unspoken agreement, to move forward, not by forgetting, but by quietly refusing to let the worst of it be the only thing that mattered. Tragedy had visited the Whittaker family, like a cold wind, swift, sharp, and senseless. But in the stillness that followed, there remained pockets of light, small stubborn embers that would not go out. Years passed, as they do, in slow layers. Maple Hollow, though forever altered, began to settle into a new kind of normal. Children born after the events of that dark spring only heard the name Whittaker, in passing, usually in whispers among older neighbors, or in the rare quickly shut down conversations among teenagers curious about the house at the end of Applegate Lane.
Time had done what it always does. Softened the edges, let the grass grow over the cracked sidewalk, let memory go a little hazy in favor of the day-to-day. But for those who had lived through it, who had known Marcus as a boy or shared a recipe with Catherine, nothing truly faded. In her small bungalow near the edge of town, Mary Klein was now 83. Her hands had grown slower, and her garden was a little wilder than it used to be, but she still took her morning tea on the porch, still watched the street like she had for decades. The Whitaker house, now owned by a quiet couple who kept to themselves, had been renovated and repainted, but Mary could still see the outline of the old porch swing in her mind. One afternoon in early April, Mary received a letter. It was simple. No return address, just a postmark from Maine. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a photograph. The photo was grainy and soft around the edges. It showed a man sitting on a bench in what looked like a hospital courtyard. His hair was longer now, salt and pepper at the temples, and his posture was still slightly hunched, but his face was peaceful. He wore a hand-knit green sweater. A bird bath stood in the background. A few daffodils peeked from behind the bench. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was careful and neat. He listens to music now, mostly piano. He doesn't speak often, but sometimes he smiles. Thought you might want to know. Mary held the photo in her lap for a long time. The wind picked up a little, lifting the corner of the envelope. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, as if to acknowledge something. An ache, a relief, a long unspoken hope finally finding voice. Marcus Whitaker had been 28 when the world broke. Now in his early 40s, he lived not in freedom, but in a form of stability. His days were structured, quiet. He kept a journal, though no one could read it, just pages of symbols and loops and sketches that seemed meaningful only to him. Staff at the facility said he rarely engaged with other patients, but responded well to music therapy, and often sat in the garden during good weather. One nurse, Carla, had taken a quiet interest in his care. She described him as gentle, in a way that makes you ache. She didn't excuse what he had done. No one did, but she often wondered aloud how much of Marcus remained in the man he had become. Was he a boy frozen in trauma, trapped in a mind that betrayed him, or had he found some way, in the silence and the structure, to build a small version of peace? When asked directly, Marcus would rarely respond. But once, during an art therapy session, Carla noticed he had drawn something different from his usual abstract shapes. It was a house, crude and childlike, but unmistakable. A two-story white home with shutters and a picket fence. There were flowers in the yard, and three figures standing by the mailbox, a man, a woman, and a young boy holding a kite. He hadn't titled it, but the intent was clear. He didn't show it to anyone. Carla only glimpsed it as he slipped it into a folder, his expression blank. But for her, it was the clearest signal yet. The past hadn't been erased. It lived inside him, even now, like a dream he was still trying to interpret. Back in Maple Hollow, change continued its slow, inevitable march. The bakery on Main Street changed owners again. The old library received a grant, and was finally updated with Wi-Fi and a coffee bar. New families moved in. Most never knew the full story of what had happened in the town they now called home. They didn't know about the red tape that bound a house to grief, or the soft steps of a child walking too quietly for anyone to notice something was wrong. But some did know, and they chose to stay anyway. Because life, even after horror, goes on. Rebecca Dunn, Marcus's half-sister, visited less often now, not because she had stopped caring, but because she had built a life for herself that didn't revolve around tragedy. She wrote when she could, sometimes sending newspaper clippings, or old family recipes she thought Marcus might remember. One winter, she mailed him a snow globe with a tiny lighthouse inside, knowing he liked to watch the light reflect in the glass. It was unclear whether he understood the significance of the gifts, but he always kept them. Dr. Greaves eventually retired from Fort Leatham. She wrote a paper about her years with Marcus, published quietly in a professional journal. She didn't name him. She called him Patient M. The article focused not on the crime, but on the struggle of balancing empathy with accountability. She wrote about silence, about the limits of language, and about the rare quiet moments when she thought she saw the boy inside the man. One line stood out from the piece. "There is a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just sits in the room with you, patient and endless." As for the town, they never held a memorial. There was no plaque for Catherine and Harold, no scholarship fund or candlelight vigil, but their names were kept alive in quieter ways. Catherine's carrot soup recipe was still passed around the church group. Harold's old mower, sold at a yard sale years ago, still sputtered to life every spring on the far side of town. And Marcus, even from afar, remained a part of Maple Hollow's DNA, not as a monster, not as a legend, but as a reminder that mental illness is not just a headline, that people can be both loved and broken, that sometimes horror doesn't come from strangers, but from within the walls of the safest places we know, and that healing, when it comes at all, is slow, uneven, fragile, but real. It exists in the notes of a piano melody, drifting through a hospital hallway, in the photo of a man on a bench, wearing a green sweater knit by a sister he never knew, in the voice of an elderly neighbor, placing daisies by an old mailbox, whispering a name she can't forget. Some stories don't end with justice or redemption, some just end quietly, and life continues.
Now, let's take a slow breath, settle in. Tonight's second case begins on a quiet, tree-lined street in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa. A town where front doors are often left unlocked, neighbors wave as they mow their lawns, and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on. It's the kind of place where you wouldn't expect darkness to linger. But as we'll see, darkness doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it moves in quietly, unnoticed, until it's far too late. On the surface, the Wilcox family appeared picture perfect. Thomas Wilcox, a high school history teacher with a love for Civil War reenactments, was well liked by his students and admired by his colleagues. His wife Denise ran a small but successful local bakery known for its pecan sticky buns. Together, they raised two children, Caitlin, 15, and her younger brother Mason, 11. They lived in a cozy colonial home with blue shutters and a neatly trimmed hedge. Church on Sundays, barbecues in the summer, PTA meetings and science fairs, it was all so ordinary. But ordinary can sometimes be the best disguise for secrets. It was a Monday morning in late October when Denise failed to open the bakery. Locals figured maybe she had caught a cold or overslept. But when the doors remained closed the next day as well, and the bakery phone rang unanswered, a friend and fellow business owner, Carla Jennings, stopped by the Wilcox home to check in. She knocked. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Still silence. The house looked undisturbed. No broken windows, no signs of distress. But something didn't feel right. Carla peeked through the front window and saw a plate of untouched breakfast on the dining table, and beyond that, a lamp still glowing in the corner, despite the daylight. She decided to call the police. When officers arrived, they knocked and announced themselves, but like Carla, were met with silence. Eventually, they made the call to enter through the back door, which was unlocked. What they found inside would unravel not just a mystery, but a horrifying twist of reality no one in Cedar Falls had imagined. The Wilcox home was eerily quiet. No signs of a struggle, no immediate signs of violence. The breakfast plates were set for 4. A teapot sat cold on the stove. Upstairs, the children's beds were made, untouched. A dog leash lay by the door, but the family's golden retriever, Scout, was nowhere in sight. Then in the master bedroom, police found Thomas Wilcox. He was lying in bed, fully clothed, hands folded across his chest. He looked as though he might have simply fallen asleep, until they noticed the faint discoloration around his mouth and the stillness that went beyond slumber. He was dead. Cause unknown at that moment. But it was what they didn't find that was even more disturbing. Denise, Caitlin, and Mason were missing. There was no note, no signs of forced entry, no blood, no packed suitcases. Just Thomas, dead in bed, and the quiet hum of a refrigerator, echoing through a house that should have been full of life. The search for Denise and the children began immediately. Flyers were printed. Social media alerts were issued. Volunteers combed nearby woods and riverbanks. Drones scanned the area. It was as if the family had vanished into thin air. Friends described Denise as devoted and protective, not the type to run off, especially without a word, and certainly not leaving her husband behind. Others wondered if perhaps she had found Thomas dead and fled in panic, taking the kids to safety. But as hours turned to days, that theory became harder to believe. An autopsy on Thomas revealed the presence of a powerful sedative in his system, one not typically prescribed or commonly found. The dosage was enough to slow his breathing, eventually stopping his heart. There were no defensive wounds, no trauma, no alcohol or recreational drugs, just that quiet, invisible substance. It looked less like an accident, and more like murder. But who would want to hurt a quiet history teacher in a sleepy Iowa town? And more importantly, where was his family? Investigators turned their attention to the Wilcox computer, hoping for emails, calendar entries, or digital clues. They found recent searches for peaceful sleep, non-violent ways to die, and funeral costs. But oddly, these weren't under Thomas's login, they were under Denise's. Was she researching these things for herself? For Thomas? The tone of the searches suggested deep, spiraling thoughts, possibly depression, or something else. Neighbors told police that the family had seemed a little off in recent weeks. Denise, normally chatty and cheerful, had grown quieter. Caitlin, once the star of the school choir, had recently quit. Mason hadn't been seen playing outside as often. One neighbor mentioned seeing the kids getting into a car late one evening, one that wasn't the family's SUV. That detail was dismissed at first, until another neighbor confirmed the same. A dark gray sedan, no plates, tinted windows. When police traced the family's cell phones, they discovered something chilling. Denise's phone had last pinged 2 towns over, near an abandoned rest stop on Route 84. But the location was logged at 2:11 a.m., hours after she had supposedly disappeared. A security camera from a nearby gas station caught a blurry glimpse of a woman matching her description at a payphone. That was the last time she was ever seen alive. Days stretched into weeks, tips came and went, but no firm leads developed. Candlelight vigils were held. Caitlin's high school locker became a memorial covered in sticky notes, photos and flowers. Her friends described her as kind, insightful, and recently, withdrawn. A teacher admitted she'd once confided that something bad was coming. When asked to elaborate, Caitlin had only said, "It's better if you don't know." Then, nearly 3 weeks after the disappearance, the Wilcox SUV was discovered deep in a wooded area, nearly 100 miles from Cedar Falls. It was partially obscured by brush and leaves, as though someone had deliberately tried to hide it. Inside were the remains of Denise and the 2 children, Caitlin and Mason. All 3 had died of asphyxiation. There were no signs of restraint, struggle, or external injury. Only peace, stillness, and silence. In the back seat, detectives found a manila folder tucked under the floor mat. Inside were 3 letters, one addressed to each child, and a third labeled for anyone who cares. The contents would raise even more questions than they answered. The town mourned. The headlines painted Denise as a broken woman who had taken her children's lives before ending her own. But was that really the truth? As investigators dug deeper into the Wilcox family history, a different story began to emerge, one that suggested a hidden life, a growing paranoia, and a secret Denise may have been willing to kill to protect. And somewhere in that unfolding mystery was a shocking truth no one had expected. The discovery of the Wilcox SUV changed everything. For weeks the mystery had clung to Cedar Falls like fog, thick, quiet, heavy. With each passing day, hope dimmed.
And yet the reality was somehow worse. In that wooded clearing 100 miles away, hidden under fallen leaves and near rotting pine needles, Denise Wilcox and her children were found lying as if asleep, buckled in their seats, one behind the other. The coroner would later note there were no signs of a struggle, no wounds, no bruises, no marks of force. The children wore soft, clean pajamas. Denise had on a cardigan, zipped just below the collarbone, her hands folded across her stomach. Each had succumbed to asphyxiation, carbon monoxide poisoning, most likely, the slow and painless kind, often called a quiet death. The car keys were still in the ignition. A rubber hose led from the tailpipe to the window, sealed with duct tape. But it was the manila envelope that shifted everything. Neatly labeled, and slipped beneath the passenger side floor mat. It felt more like a message in a bottle than a suicide note. The first two letters were personal, written in Denise's neat looped handwriting. One addressed to Caitlin, one to Mason, each folded precisely, sealed in their own envelopes. Investigators, with the family's remaining relatives' permission, would later read excerpts to understand motive. To Caitlin, Denise had written, "My darling girl, you always saw through things. I know you sensed what was happening. I know you saw the shadows that your father hid behind. I'm sorry I asked you to stay quiet. I wanted you to be safe. But safe didn't exist anymore. Not in that house. Not after what we found." The letter to Mason was shorter, more emotional, protective. "Sweet boy, you are my heart. I'm sorry I couldn't fix it. I'm sorry you had to see the things you saw. This is not your fault. You are good. You are brave. I will hold your hand until we're far away from all this." The third letter, labeled "For anyone who cares," was harder to read. It was part confession, part warning. It painted a picture that didn't align with the warm, gentle image the town had of the Wilcox family. It read, in part, "People think they know Thomas, but they never saw him behind closed doors. He was careful, so careful. But things cracked open last year. Caitlin found his journals in the basement, behind the water heater. She thought they were old family notes. They weren't. They were something else." Investigators were stunned. This was the first they'd heard of journals. Up to that point, Thomas Wilcox had seemed the most innocent part of the puzzle, a man who died quietly in his bed, left behind by a wife who perhaps suffered a mental break. But now, that narrative was shifting. He kept photos. The letter continued. Not of us, not of family, of strangers, boys, young boys, all with names, some scratched out, dates, notes. Some were missing posters, some weren't. I burned what I could before he came home. Mason too. They stopped sleeping. The tone of the letter shifted again. A mother's panic. Her heartbreak. I went to the police once. Spoke in riddles. Asked what they'd do if someone found something disturbing. I didn't use names. I was scared. They told me to report it properly. File forms. Make statements. I couldn't risk him knowing. He watched everything. Everything. At this point, detectives returned to the Wilcox home for a second, deeper search. The first pass had been respectful, gentle. This time they pulled up floorboards, searched beneath insulation, opened sealed crawl spaces, and in the narrow crawl space behind the basement water heater, they found a box, inside 7 journals, leather-bound, numbered, each detailed thoughts that were troubling at best, disturbing at worst. The language was cryptic but obsessive, pages filled with names, birth dates, physical descriptions. Some were clearly fabricated, fictional fantasies. Others referenced real children who had been reported missing in the Midwest over the past 15 years. One name appeared repeatedly, KCH. Investigators ran the name through the national database and found a match, Casey Harper, a 13-year-old boy who had vanished from Missouri in 2009 while riding his bike to a nearby convenience store. The case had gone cold years ago. His body had never been found. In one of Thomas's journals, written in smeared ink and frantic loops, was this entry: KCH, Smelled like oranges. He said he didn't want to go, but they always say that. I told him to be still, and he was. There was no proof beyond the journals. No physical evidence. No bodies. But the implication was enough to shatter any remaining illusion. Thomas Wilcox was no longer the passive victim in the family's tragedy. He was its architect, hidden in plain sight. The community of Cedar Falls reeled. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Teachers quietly asked if anyone remembered Thomas acting strangely. Some came forward. Some didn't. A former student, now 27, recalled a strange encounter in detention years earlier. Thomas had asked him to stay late, alone, to discuss behavioral patterns. Nothing had happened, but the boy remembered the feeling, the cold in his stomach, the way Thomas locked the classroom door and pulled the blinds. The memory hadn't made sense until now. Then came another twist, one that no one had seen coming. Among the recovered journals was a single USB drive taped to the inside cover of Journal 6. It was encrypted, password protected, but not unbreakable. Forensic analysts cracked the code within days. The drive contained a series of scanned documents, driver's licenses, student IDs, school rosters, and one document stood out, an old scan of a birth certificate. Name Gavin Thomas Wilcox. But Gavin wasn't one of the Wilcox children. Not Caitlin. Not Mason. A background search revealed something even more disturbing. Thomas Wilcox had a son from a previous relationship. A son he had never spoken of publicly. A son who had been reported missing in 1997, at the age of 8 in Denver, Colorado. The boy's mother, Melissa Parrish, had told police that Thomas had taken Gavin for a weekend visit and never returned him. When investigators tracked down Thomas months later, he claimed Gavin had run away while at a campground in northern Idaho. A search had been launched, but no body was found. Thomas was never charged. The case went cold, and Thomas moved to Iowa. Denise likely never knew, or if she did, she never told a soul. The deeper the investigation went, the more pieces fell into place. The journals weren't confessions in the traditional sense. They were trophies, fantasies, memories, proof that something vile had lived under that quiet blue roof, that Thomas Wilcox was not a broken man abandoned by his family. He was a predator. And Denise was not a killer. She was a mother trying to shield her children from something she no longer knew how to escape. But her method, her choice, left the town divided. Some called her heroic. Others said she became what she feared. A woman who robbed her children of a life they might have survived, even if that life had been steeped in trauma. But there was still one detail left unresolved. Something that didn't quite fit. In Denise's final letter, she wrote, "He wasn't working alone. I know that now. I saw a name, a number. I memorized it. Wrote it down. It's in the place I always kept secrets. Inside the hollow of the upstairs closet wall. Behind the shelf." Investigators returned to the house again. This time they found a torn piece of envelope tucked into a crevice behind the upper closet shelf in Caitlin's room. Written on it were two things. A name, Pastor Reuben Hill, and a phone number with a Colorado area code. The story wasn't over. The name Reverend Reuben Hill was not known in Cedar Falls. He hadn't led a service in the town, hadn't spoken at its vigils, hadn't married or buried anyone there. Yet his name, scrawled in trembling ink behind the closet wall of Caitlin Wilcox's bedroom, had now become the dark center of an expanding circle of questions. Detectives traced the number to a small Baptist church outside of Boulder, Colorado. The church itself, New Grace Fellowship, had closed its doors in 2011, following allegations of financial misconduct. No charges had ever been brought. The website was long defunct. Its building now stood empty behind a shuttered gas station, the steeple leaning slightly eastward like a man caught mid-whisper. Reverend Hill, however, was still alive. He lived in a modest single-story home on the edge of Loveland, Colorado, about 45 minutes north of Denver. He'd retired, kept to himself, and volunteered twice a week at a veterans' food pantry. When authorities visited, he answered the door slowly, with a cane in one hand and a ceramic coffee mug in the other. His hair was white, neatly combed. He wore reading glasses and spoke in soft, measured tones. When asked about Thomas Wilcox, he blinked once, twice, then offered a tight, practiced smile. "I knew a Thomas Wilcox," he said, almost too casually. "Years ago, he came through the church after a hard time. Needed direction." "What kind of direction?" one of the detectives asked. Reverend Hill paused. "The kind men seek when they're haunted by something." He wasn't very forthcoming. Quiet man. Polite though. Stayed for a while, then moved on. But the detective wasn't satisfied with vague recollections. He produced the photo of Gavin Thomas Wilcox, the boy who vanished in 1997, the son Thomas never acknowledged. Hill looked at it for a long time. "I remember him," he said softly. "They came to services together a few times. Gavin always had a book in his hands. Loved to read. Did you know the boy went missing?" The Reverend's eyes, tired and rimmed with age, stayed on the photograph. "I did," he said. "Thomas told us Gavin ran away. There was a search. I helped organize volunteers. Never found a trace." There was a pause, thick and uneasy. Then Hill added, "You don't forget something like that." The detectives asked for his phone records, his correspondence with Thomas, any old church files. Reverend Hill declined at first. Then with a long sigh, he stepped aside and invited them in. The inside of the house was tidy. Old hymns played softly from a radio in the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of tea tree oil and dust. Over the next 2 hours, investigators took notes, catalogued a dozen storage boxes from the garage, and asked questions Hill always seemed to answer just a beat too slowly. He explained that he hadn't spoken to Thomas in over 10 years, that they'd lost contact after the church closed, that he didn't know where Thomas had gone afterward. But one box, pulled from the back of a closet, changed the tone of the visit. Inside were dozens of letters. Not church documents. Not ministry schedules. But personal letters. From Thomas. The earliest dated back to 1996. The latest was from just 6 months before Denise and the children disappeared. Each letter had the same pattern. Casual updates. Vague spiritual reflections. And often disturbingly, stories. Written in a tone that sounded both confessional and euphoric. The language was coded, but not subtle. He spoke of struggles with sin, of walking paths I know are wrong but feel like home. He mentioned names, ages, moments that read like memories. Reverend Hill never scolded him, never advised him to go to police or confess. Instead, his letters replied with scriptures, encouragement, warnings to remain in grace and keep temptation in the shadows, lest light undo the order of things. One passage in particular chilled investigators. "I understand the hunger, Thomas. I know it. And I know the emptiness after. But God sees us not for our sickness, but for our striving. Keep what you must buried, and keep your face toward the light. They are not lambs if they do not know the shepherd." This was not ministry. This was complicity. Detectives later told reporters that Reuben Hill had not merely failed to stop Thomas Wilcox. He had in some dark and deliberate way encouraged him. Authorities sought a warrant for Hill's arrest on charges of obstruction, accessory to child endangerment, and possible conspiracy. But before they could act, the story took yet another turn. 3 days later, a neighbor reported seeing a light on in Hill's garage well past midnight. When police arrived, they found Hill inside, sitting on a stool beside a workbench. He was alive, but barely. He'd attempted suicide with prescription medication and alcohol. A Bible lay open on the bench. Beside it, a single sheet of paper with the words, "I was afraid. I let fear guide me. And fear is the true sin." He was rushed to the hospital, and eventually stabilized. But after that night, Reuben Hill never spoke another word to investigators. He remained silent through trial proceedings, never testified, never answered the questions that hung so heavily over the case. What did he know? Who else might have been involved? More importantly, were there more victims? Because something else had surfaced. In the final letter Denise Wilcox left, the one tucked beneath the floor mat in her SUV, she mentioned a phrase Thomas used often in his sleep. He would mutter it over and over. She wrote, "Whisper it like a chant. The hollow keeps them. The hollow keeps them." Investigators didn't understand it at first. But after finding his journals, and learning of his past in Colorado, they began to suspect the hollow wasn't just poetic. It was literal. A location. They searched old maps, looked for natural hollows, sinkholes, abandoned buildings, and that's when one name surfaced: Hollow Creek Preserve. Located an hour outside Boulder, the preserve was once part of a massive private estate. The original Manda had burned down in the 1950s, leaving only stone ruins, cellar entrances, and a partially collapsed hunting cabin. The land was later donated to the state, but remained undeveloped, overgrown and largely forgotten. When cadaver dogs were brought to the site, they alerted almost immediately. In a shallow pit beneath the remnants of the cabin's foundation, search teams uncovered 2 small human skeletons. A third was found buried near a dried-up stream bed, wrapped in decaying plastic. The bones were aged, fragile. One had a bracelet still clinging to a wrist, plastic beads spelling out Casey. DNA later confirmed it. One of the bodies belonged to Casey Harper, the missing boy from 2009. The others, still unidentified, are believed to be among the unnamed children from Thomas Wilcox's journals. 3 graves. Perhaps more. In a place called Hollow Creek. It explained the chant, "The hollow keeps them." And it explained something else too: why Denise Wilcox chose the end she did. Why she fled not to escape justice, but to escape a legacy of horror she could no longer contain. Her choice was tragic, unforgivable to some, understandable to others. But as the investigation closed, and as the headlines faded, the truth remained sharp. Beneath the appearance of a normal family, darkness had taken root. And no one, not the town, not the church, not even the closest neighbors had seen it until it was far too late. By the time spring returned to Cedar Falls, Iowa, the media attention had withered. The news trucks left. The national outlets turned elsewhere. In the wake of so much unspoken sorrow, the town quietly stitched itself back together, though the seams would always show. The Wilcox house remained unoccupied, boarded. The once bright hydrangeas in the front yard died in the frost and never returned. Children no longer rode bikes down that stretch of Meadowlark Lane. Parents changed their evening routines, locking doors early, leaving porch lights on even when no one was expected home. There's a strange stillness that follows a storm like the one the Wilcox case had unleashed. Not grief exactly, not fear, something quieter, a vacancy of trust. What haunted most wasn't the monstrousness of Thomas Wilcox, it was the ordinariness of him. A man who picked his kids up from school, who mowed the lawn at dusk, who barbecued on weekends, and stood in the produce aisle debating between Fuji and Honeycrisp apples. No one wants to believe that the same hand-flipping pancakes could once have carried a shovel to bury a child. But there were signs, small ones. Neighbors recalled a certain tightness in Thomas's smile, an absent look in his eyes. Denise too. Some remembered her being jumpy when someone asked about the kids' health. Others noted that the children were quiet, exceptionally well behaved, as if they'd learned early how to avoid mistakes. None of it had raised alarms, and that became its own kind of wound. The aftermath unfolded slowly. After Reuben Hill's failed suicide attempt, he remained under hospital observation, later transitioning to a long-term care facility. Legally, his silence meant that many of the questions about his involvement went unanswered. He was never convicted. Prosecutors couldn't definitively link him to any act beyond spiritual neglect and possible emotional encouragement. His letters suggested knowledge, but not knowledge precise enough to warrant charges of direct conspiracy. Some saw that as injustice. Others saw it as a mercy. He died 13 months later, quietly in his sleep. No family claimed the body. Back in Iowa, the Cedar Falls Police Department continued their investigation with somber diligence. A dedicated cold case task force was formed to re-examine missing persons files dating back 3 decades, searching for any that might connect to Thomas Wilcox, or the mysterious journeys he alluded to in his journals. Colorado, Minnesota, and Missouri law enforcement contributed to the effort. But the clues thinned, the trail faded, and slowly, the story receded into a kind of folklore, tragic, muddied, unfinished. The victims, those known and those unnamed, deserved better. Gavin Thomas Wilcox, who vanished in 1997, was never conclusively located. Some forensic analysts believe he may be among the remains found at Hollow Creek. Others argue he was buried elsewhere, in some long-forgotten back road along the highway stretch between Iowa and Denver. There was no funeral for him, no headstone, but the Cedar Falls community held a candlelight vigil for all the lost children. Hundreds turned up that October night. Parents held their kids close. A local pastor read names of known missing persons, including Casey Harper and 2 Jane Does, now simply listed in police records as unidentified 07A and unidentified 07B. Small white lanterns were released into the sky. Among the crowd was Angela Wilcox, Thomas's sister, who had flown in from Oregon. She hadn't seen her brother in more than a decade. She hadn't known about Gavin, or Denise's fate, or the horrors that had been hiding behind her family's name. Angela stayed after the ceremony, long after the lanterns had disappeared. A volunteer noticed her standing in the parking lot, staring up at the sky. "I can't picture him anymore," she said softly. "Not as a boy, not even as a monster. He's just gone." The detective who had led the case, Sergeant Dana Keller, never returned to regular duty. 6 months after the final report was filed, she transferred out of homicide, requesting a post in community outreach. Later, she explained to a local reporter, "I stopped wanting to look at crime scenes. I wanted to look people in the eye." Keller had sat across from Thomas Wilcox 3 times during the initial disappearance investigation. 3 interviews, nothing out of the ordinary. He was unreadable, she recalled, like a mirror that gives nothing back. She'd read his journal pages dozens of times. One in particular stayed with her. "There's something in the woods. Not a creature, not a ghost, just a quiet. A kind of emptiness that asks you to pour yourself into it. Once you do, there's no bottom, no self, just silence. That's the part I liked most. The silence." Psychologists debated whether Thomas was psychopathic, delusional, or simply broken, but there were no easy labels. His past gave no hints of childhood abuse, no medical history of mental illness. He had been a boy with good grades, a passion for science fiction novels, and a love for camping. Somewhere along the line, something had broken, not snapped, but crumbled, like a dam eroding quietly under pressure. The tragedy lay not only in what he did, but in how ordinary his descent had looked from the outside. And what of Denise? Her note left in the car was written in a rushed looping script. It was not a full confession, but it hinted at complicity, at knowing too late the depth of her husband's evil, and being unable, or unwilling to stop it. Whether she participated in his crimes, helped him conceal them, or simply turned a blind eye remains a matter of speculation. Her body was cremated. No memorial was held. Her children, Emma and Caleb, were buried side by side in the Cedar Falls Municipal Cemetery, their graves marked with simple headstones chosen by the community. Emma Rose Wilcox, 2007, 2023. Beloved daughter, gentle soul, Caleb Aaron Wilcox, 2009, 2023. A heart full of wonder. A local florist keeps fresh flowers at their plot. No one quite knows who pays for them. One final question lingered longer than the rest. How could no one have known? How does a family collapse so completely, with no outward signs? Some survivors of similar stories, parents of missing children, victims of family abuse, offered a familiar explanation. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it lives behind smiling windows and perfectly raked lawns. Sometimes it wears a father's face. And sometimes the most dangerous people are those who are quietest, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're hiding what should never be spoken aloud. As summer returned to Cedar Falls the following year, children rode bikes again on Meadowlark Lane. A new family moved in 2 doors down from the Wilcox house, unaware of its past. The grass grew tall around the boarded windows, then yellowed.
On the night of April 16th, 2002, it rained in Grayson, Pennsylvania. Not a dramatic thunderstorm, not the kind of downpour that drowns streets and shutters windows. Just a slow, steady rain, the sort that taps gently on rooftops and turns the pavement into dark glass. The kind of rain that makes you linger in bed, makes you pause under awnings, makes everything feel a little slower, softer. Grayson was a quiet town, even by Pennsylvania standards. Just under 6,000 residents, most of whom had lived there their entire lives. It was a town of modest clapboard homes, white picket fences, and faded American flags hanging year-round. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. At 9:41 p.m., the phone at the Grayson Police Department rang. The dispatcher, a woman named Marlene, who had worked the desk for 17 years, answered with her usual quiet drawl. On the line was a woman's voice, frantic, breathless. "My sister didn't come home," the caller said. "She was just going to the store." The woman was Hannah Illy, 29 years old, a dental hygienist and lifelong Grayson resident. She was calling about her younger sister, Mallory. Mallory Illy, 24, had left the house around 8:10 that evening to walk to Miller's Market, a small convenience store 5 blocks away. She'd gone out in just a light jacket, despite the rain, saying she wouldn't be long. She needed eggs and toothpaste. That's what she told her sister. Eggs and toothpaste. Hannah waited an hour, then 2. By 9:30, Mallory still hadn't returned, and Hannah's calls to her cell phone went unanswered. That's when she called the police. At first, officers weren't alarmed. Adults disappear for all sorts of reasons, and it hadn't even been 2 hours. Still, because it was raining and the walk to Miller's Market was short, the patrol car was dispatched within 15 minutes. They found no trace of her. Mallory had never made it to the store. The clerk on duty didn't recall seeing her. Surveillance footage confirmed it. She never entered the shop. No passers-by had seen her either. No umbrellas, no shoes on pavement. Just the rain, falling quiet and cold. By midnight, officers began combing the route Mallory would have taken, Sycamore Hill Road, a tree-lined stretch with old stone walls and iron lampposts. It curved gently through town like a lazy stream. Children once trick-or-treated there, and teenagers still carved initials into the bark of its namesake trees. It should have been a safe path. They found one clue. Near the base of a low wall at the halfway point between the Illy home and the market, they found a single flip-flop sandal, white with a gold strap. It was soaked through, lying slightly off the curb near a puddle, Mallory's size. The same kind her sister said she'd worn out of the house. The sidewalk was otherwise clean. No blood, no signs of struggle. The rain may have washed away anything more. By morning, the search had escalated. Local news carried the story. Volunteers combed the wooded areas outside of town. A drone team from the next county flew over the Sycamore Hill ravine and the nearby quarry. Nothing. Mallory Illy had vanished into the rain. The town held its breath. She wasn't the kind of person to disappear. That's what everyone said. Mallory was grounded, gentle, reliable, a barista at the local coffee shop for 5 years. She taught Sunday school. She had a boyfriend, a close-knit group of friends, no known enemies, and no record of mental illness. She loved jazz records, and strawberry milk and old movies. She posted pictures of her dog Daisy, every week without fail. Her life wasn't remarkable in the way that draws attention, but that made her absence even more chilling. In the days that followed, search crews expanded their radius. Divers checked the quarry, dogs sniffed for scent trails, flyers were stapled to telephone poles and storefronts. Mallory's face, wide brown eyes, high cheekbones, a soft smile, became a permanent fixture on the town's bulletin boards. Her boyfriend, Eli Sanders, was questioned extensively. He had an alibi. He'd been at a poker night with co-workers, which several witnesses confirmed. Still, the police weren't fully satisfied. Relationships can mask secrets. But Eli didn't waver. He wept on camera, held vigils, passed out flyers, stopped eating, quit his job. Days became weeks. Weeks became a month. By mid-May, the police shifted terminology. They stopped calling it a missing persons case. They started calling it suspicious. That shift mattered. A few quiet facts started to emerge. For one, Hannah Illy wasn't just Mallory's sister. She was also her legal guardian. Their parents had died in a car accident when Mallory was 16. Hannah, then 21, dropped out of college to raise her. They lived in the same small house they'd grown up in, shared expenses, shared meals, even, occasionally, shared a car. Some investigators quietly wondered if their bond had been too close. But Hannah cooperated with everything. She passed 2 polygraphs, let them search the house, the car, the computer. Nothing suspicious turned up. Then came the anonymous tip. On June 3rd, nearly 7 weeks after the disappearance, a handwritten note was dropped off in the department mailbox. It was unmarked, unstamped, and written in block letters. Check Briar Hill, off Old Mill Road. You'll find her. No signature. Briar Hill was just over the county line. A thickly wooded area that once served as hunting ground and more recently, a dumping ground for used appliances and broken furniture. It was out of the way, forgotten, overgrown. A search team was dispatched that afternoon. It took nearly 7 hours. Under a low canopy of moss-draped trees, about 50 yards off the old gravel trail, they found a shallow depression in the earth, hidden beneath a fallen refrigerator. The ground had shifted recently. Something had been disturbed. Forensic crews arrived within the hour. By sundown, they had uncovered what remained of Mallory Illy. The body was badly decomposed but largely intact. Her arms had been bound with cord. There was no sign of clothing, except for the hem of her white jacket, caught beneath a root. Her skull had a single clean fracture, blunt force trauma. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of sexual assault, just a single blow. A quiet death, hidden beneath a forgotten hill. The discovery stunned the town. It wasn't just a loss, it was a betrayal, a rupture. For weeks people had prayed for a miracle, had hoped for ransom, amnesia, even voluntary disappearance. Anything but this. The funeral was held at St. Thomas Church on a warm Thursday morning. Over 300 people attended. Eli Sanders stood at the front, holding a framed photograph of Mallory. Hannah spoke briefly, through tears. She didn't deserve this, she said. She just wanted to live her life. But behind the grief, something darker loomed. A question no one wanted to voice yet. Who had sent the note? And how did they know where she was? The days that followed the grim discovery of Mallory's body were heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional whispered conversation at the local diner or the distant wail of sirens patrolling the town's outskirts. Grayson had become a place where eyes averted, where people hesitated to ask questions aloud, where the shadows on Sycamore Hill seemed to grow longer with every passing sunset. The police department, meanwhile, found itself at the center of a complex and frustrating investigation. The discovery of the body was a breakthrough, but it brought with it more questions than answers. The note that had led them there was as mysterious as the crime itself. It seemed to come from someone who knew more than they were willing to say, someone who wanted the body found. But why? Detective James Whitaker was assigned to lead the case. A man in his mid-40s with a weathered face and a quiet intensity, Whitaker had been with the Grayson Police Department for nearly 2 decades. He knew the town well and had seen his share of tragic cases, but this one unsettled him deeply. Mallory's murder was different. It was clean, precise, and yet coldly personal. Whitaker began by revisiting every detail of Mallory's last known movements. He retraced the route from the Illy home to Miller's Market on Sycamore Hill Road, a path familiar to most in town. He walked it slowly, eyes scanning the cracked sidewalks, the moss-covered stones, the wet leaves curling in corners. The rain that night had erased much of the physical evidence, but Whitaker knew that people rarely forget what they see. He started knocking on doors, speaking quietly with neighbors who had lived there for years. Many said they'd seen Mallory that evening, walking briskly, headphones in, eyes fixed straight ahead. Others remembered the rain, the quiet street, the absence of any disturbance. One woman, Mrs. Lillian Harper, who lived 2 houses down from the Illys, recalled something else. She looked scared. Mrs. Harper said, "I was sitting on my porch around 8:30 when I saw her walking past. She glanced back over her shoulder like someone was following her. But when I looked, there was no one there, just the trees and the rain." Whitaker made note of this. Fear. Someone had frightened Mallory that night. He then turned to Mallory's friends and acquaintances. The circle was small: coffee shop co-workers, Sunday school classmates, a handful of people from town. No one reported any recent arguments or conflicts. No threats. No enemies, except one, Eli Sanders, the boyfriend. While Eli had an alibi for the night of April 16th, investigators found that the relationship was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Neighbors reported frequent heated arguments heard through thin walls. Some friends described Eli as possessive, jealous even, a man who sometimes lost control. Eli denied any involvement, of course. He wept openly in interviews and offered to take another polygraph test. Yet Whitaker couldn't ignore the inconsistencies. Eli's stories sometimes shifted, details changed subtly, and there was a dark edge beneath his grief. Still, without hard evidence, charges could not be made. The investigation then explored other leads. Hannah Ellie was questioned at length again. This time the focus was on the mysterious note. She admitted to no knowledge of its origins, but seemed shaken by the suggestion someone close to Mallory might have written it. Police scanned her communications, searched her computer, checked phone records. Nothing suspicious emerged, yet tension remained. As days passed, rumors began to circulate in Grayson. The town's newspaper, the Grayson Gazette, published a front-page article with the headline, "Whispered Secrets of Sycamore Hill." It speculated about a shadowy figure lurking in the wooded areas outside of town, a man who had been seen on multiple occasions around the old quarry and the abandoned mill road. Neighbors spoke of a strange man, tall and thin, always watching but never speaking. Some said he disappeared when approached. Others said they'd seen him late at night, sitting on the stone walls, smoking cigarettes, eyes glinting in the darkness. The police followed up but found no solid leads. No record of the man's identity or whereabouts. Meanwhile, the town struggled with the aftermath of Mallory's death. Friends and family grappled with grief, confusion, and the haunting absence of closure. Mallory's dog, Daisy, was taken in by Hannah, who spoke of the dog as a small comfort amidst the storm. The church held weekly vigils. The coffee shop set up a memorial corner with candles and flowers, and the local high school dedicated the spring dance to Mallory's memory. Despite the community's efforts, the killer remained at large. Months later, a breakthrough came, not from forensic evidence or eyewitnesses, but from an unexpected source, a letter. It arrived at the police station on a chilly October morning, addressed simply to Detective Whitaker. The letter was typed, short and chillingly precise. "You look in the wrong places. She was not taken. She was betrayed. Look closer." No signature. No return address. Whitaker read the note twice. The handwriting, machine-generated,
was deliberate and calm. There was no panic, no desperation, just a quiet warning. Whitaker pondered the message for days. Not taken. Betrayed. The implication was clear. Mallory had known her killer. The threat had come from someone she trusted. The detective began to revisit the people closest to Mallory once more. Friends, family, co-workers, everyone who had been in her life. One name that kept appearing was a co-worker at the coffee shop, Lauren Briggs. Lauren was quiet, unassuming, and had worked alongside Mallory for 3 years. On the surface, their relationship seemed friendly, if somewhat reserved. But Lauren had a history of jealousy and petty quarrels. Several employees recalled heated exchanges between her and Mallory, particularly in the weeks before the disappearance. More disturbingly, Lauren had suddenly quit her job the day after Mallory was reported missing. When questioned, Lauren denied any involvement. She said she left because she couldn't bear the atmosphere, that she hadn't seen Mallory that night, that she had an alibi, yet the police found inconsistencies. Lauren's alibi was shaky at best. Her friends said she had been home alone, and no one could confirm her whereabouts between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on April 16th. Worse, phone records showed a brief call from Lauren's cell phone to Mallory's phone at 8:07 p.m., minutes before Mallory left the house. Lauren claimed it was accidental, a misdial, but Whitaker suspected it was something else. He decided to bring Lauren in for a more thorough interview. Under questioning, Lauren's composure cracked. She admitted to arguing with Mallory earlier that evening, over a personal matter. She claimed the disagreement had been trivial, but it was enough to sour their friendship. She denied harming Mallory, but the cracks in her story deepened. She confessed that she had driven down Sycamore Hill Road after work that night, something she had not mentioned before. She claimed she hadn't seen Mallory, but Whitaker sensed the hesitation in her voice. With no direct evidence linking Lauren to the crime, the case stalled again, but Whitaker believed the answers were buried beneath the surface, within the quiet betrayals, the hidden resentments, the unseen fractures in a small town's fabric. Grayson remained a town shadowed by loss. The rain continued to fall now and then, washing away footprints, but never erasing the memory of that last call. As autumn deepened, the chill in the air seemed to seep into every corner of Grayson. Leaves fell in thick blankets across the sidewalks, their rustling underfoot the only sound during long, quiet evenings. Sycamore Hill, once a place of serene walks and late-night talks, had become a stretch of road haunted by the weight of unanswered questions. Detective Whitaker felt the pressure mounting. The months since Mallory Ellie's body had been found had passed without a break in the case. The letter that arrived in October, with its cold admonition to look closer, had prompted deeper investigations, but nothing definitive had emerged. Every lead seemed to twist back upon itself, every witness statement fractured by doubt. Whitaker knew that in cases like this, sometimes it wasn't about the dramatic evidence, but the subtle details, the quiet inconsistencies, the small betrayals hidden beneath everyday life. He returned again to the people Mallory had trusted most. Hannah Illy, Mallory's mother, had kept herself busy with memorials and counseling sessions, but Whitaker could see the exhaustion etched deep into her face. In their interviews, she spoke gently of Mallory's hopes and fears, the small kindnesses she showed to others, and the growing unease she had sensed in her daughter's final days. She wasn't the same girl, Hannah said softly. Something was bothering her, but she never told me. I wish she had. Whitaker understood that feeling all too well, how grief could twist into regret, how the silence of lost loved ones pressed down harder than any spoken words. In contrast, Eli Saunders, Mallory's former boyfriend, had become increasingly reclusive. After months of questioning and suspicion, he retreated from the community. His social media profiles were deleted, and he moved out of town without fanfare. Some in Grayson believed him innocent, others thought he might have fled guilt. Whitaker kept Eli on his radar, but recognized the limits of his investigation there. Without physical evidence, his involvement was speculative. More than anything, Whitaker sensed that the real story lay in the fractured relationships around Mallory, relationships marked by jealousy, secrets, and the desperate need for control. Lauren Briggs, the co-worker with the shaky alibi, remained a person of interest, but her story was elusive. She declined further interviews, hiring a lawyer who advised silence. Frustrated, but undeterred, Whitaker turned to technology for help. Forensic specialists re-examined Mallory's phone records and text messages with newer software, hoping to uncover deleted messages or overlooked clues. New technology revealed fragments of conversations that hinted at someone pressuring Mallory to keep quiet about something important, but the sender's identity was obscured by encryption. The more Whitaker dug, the clearer it became that Mallory had been trapped in a web of fear and manipulation. But by whom? The turning point came unexpectedly. One cold November morning, a young man named Caleb Morgan walked into the police station. Caleb was a quiet figure around town, known mostly as an artist, who kept to himself. But that morning, his eyes were wide with urgency. "I have something to tell you," he said simply. Caleb explained that he had been close friends with Mallory's younger brother Noah. One evening, months before the murder, Noah had confided in him about a strange visitor who had come to their house, someone who had whispered threats and warnings, someone who wanted to silence Mallory forever. The description was vague, but Caleb's revelation opened a new door. Whitaker arranged to speak with Noah, now guarded and withdrawn since his sister's death. In their conversation, Noah described the visitor as a man with sharp eyes and a cold smile. He didn't know the man's name, but remembered a distinct scent of cedarwood and tobacco. This visitor had come twice in the spring, each time leaving Mallory more frightened than before. Noah's story matched an incident reported by another witness, a local groundskeeper, who had seen a man lurking near the Ellie property late at night. This man's presence was never reported until now, perhaps out of fear or disbelief. Whitaker began to connect the dots. He dug into local records and found a man named Garrett Hale, recently released from prison for assault and intimidation charges. Hale was known for his volatile temper and a past marked by violent encounters. More disturbingly, Hale had a history with the Ellie family. Years before, he had been involved in a bitter dispute over land with Mallory's father. The conflict had ended quietly, but tensions remained beneath the surface. Whitaker sought Hale out, tracking him to a rundown apartment on the edge of Grayson. The man answered the door with a defiant glare, cigarette in hand. Hale denied any involvement with Mallory's death, claiming he had been trying to rebuild his life. But his evasiveness and inconsistent answers only deepened Whitaker's suspicion. Over the following weeks, surveillance on Hale revealed more strange behavior: late-night drives near Sycamore Hill, calls to unknown numbers, and visits to locations linked to Mallory's social circle. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, Whitaker struggled to find concrete proof tying Hale to the murder. No physical evidence placed him at the scene, and his alibi for the night of April 16th was thin but unbroken. Meanwhile, Grayson's residents grew restless. The autumn air was filled with whispers and worry. Parents kept children close, friends eyed strangers with suspicion, and the shadows on Sycamore Hill seemed to stretch longer, as if watching, waiting. Whitaker felt the weight of these silent fears. He worked long hours, chasing leads, piecing together timelines, and sifting through fragments of truth. One evening, while reviewing Mallory's diary, discovered in a hidden compartment in her bedroom, Whitaker found passages that spoke of feeling trapped and watched. "I don't know who to trust anymore." One entry read, "Every shadow feels like a threat. I'm afraid of what might happen if I say too much." These words echoed the letter sent to the police months earlier. She was betrayed. But by whom? The diary also mentioned a secret meeting scheduled for April 17th, the day after Mallory disappeared. She wrote about planning to meet someone who could help her break free. Whitaker reached out to friends and contacts, trying to identify who this mysterious person might be. Slowly, a picture emerged of someone outside Mallory's immediate circle, a mentor figure, someone who had offered support when she felt isolated. This lead brought Whitaker to a local counselor named Dr. Evelyn Marks, who had worked with troubled teens for years. Dr. Marks confirmed she had been meeting with Mallory sporadically, but said she hadn't heard from her after mid-April. The detective wondered if this meeting might have been Mallory's last hope, or her final trap. As the investigation pressed on, Whitaker found himself standing once again on Sycamore Hill Road, the rain softening the edges of the night. He looked toward the trees, imagining the silent witness of the forest, the secrets buried beneath its roots. In Grayson, life moved on, but the echoes of that last call lingered, reminding everyone that even in quiet towns, beneath the surface of everyday life, darkness can take root, and the truth can be as elusive as the fading light of dusk. The cold lingered in the air like a stubborn shadow, as winter edged closer, and Detective Whitaker found himself entwined deeper within the tangled threads of Mallory Ellie's final days. The closer he came to uncovering the truth, the more the case seemed to slip like smoke through his fingers. The last diary entry, the one that mentioned a secret meeting on April 17th, now became a focal point in the investigation. Whitaker knew that date was crucial, the day after Mallory's disappearance, the day that could hold the key to the entire mystery. He sat across from Dr. Evelyn Marks, in her modest office, walls lined with books and calming artwork. She was cautious, measured in her speech, but there was a softness to her demeanor that suggested genuine care for her patients. Mallory was fragile, Dr. Marks said quietly. She carried a lot of weight, more than most people knew, but she wanted to find a way out. That meeting she mentioned, I think it was supposed to be with someone she trusted, someone who could help her make sense of everything. Whitaker pressed gently. Do you know who that someone was? Dr. Marks hesitated before replying. No, she never said, but if I had to guess, it was someone from her past. Someone she believed could protect her. The ambiguity was frustrating, but it was the first real lead Whitaker had felt in months. He returned to the Ellie family home that evening, hoping to find more in Mallory's room. The space was untouched since the day they found her, a shrine of frozen moments. Whitaker carefully examined the desk again, the clutter of school books, journals and scattered photographs. Among the photos was one that caught his eye. Mallory with a young man named Derek, a childhood friend from town who had recently moved away after a family scandal. Whitaker recalled hearing about Derek's sudden departure, an incident involving accusations that had rocked the small community. Could Derek have been the person Mallory planned to meet? Could he have been the protector she sought? Whitaker's mind raced as he pieced together a timeline. Derek had left town 2 weeks before Mallory's disappearance, but a phone record showed a brief call between them on April 16th, the very day Mallory vanished. Tracking Derek down became a priority. After days of searching, Whitaker found him living quietly in a nearby city, trying to start over. Their meeting was tense but revealing. Derek admitted that he and Mallory had remained close despite the distance. She had confided in him, scared and desperate, about threats she felt but couldn't explain. I wanted to help her, Derek said, voice low and pained, but I was powerless. I left because I thought it would protect her, keep me out of it. I never imagined it would end like this. He revealed that Mallory had mentioned a figure who had been stalking her, a man whose presence was suffocating, relentless. This matched the description of Garrett Hale, the man Whitaker had been watching. As Whitaker returned to Grayson, the pieces began to form a chilling picture. Mallory had been trapped in a web of fear, caught between a man from her family's past, and the secrets she dared not speak aloud. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis uncovered a single hair fiber on Mallory's jacket, a rare type, matched conclusively to Garrett Hale. Confronted with this evidence, Hale broke his silence. He admitted to following Mallory, but denied harming her. According to him, he only wanted to scare her, to make her stop digging into the past. But the weight of his confession was enough to charge him with obstruction and intimidation. Yet the mystery of what truly happened on that cold April night lingered. No one could say for certain what happened after Mallory left home that evening. Some whispered that she tried to escape, that she confronted her fears, and found a tragic end. Others believed she had a final act of courage, a silent rebellion that no one would ever know. In the quiet town of Grayson, the question remained how much of Mallory's story was ever meant to be told. Detective Whitaker often found himself back on Sycamore Hill Road, gazing at the trees that stood like sentinels against time. The murder of Mallory Ellie was a puzzle of shadows and silences, a reminder that beneath the calmest surfaces, pain and fear can twist into tragedy. Her story was a whisper lost in the wind, a haunting echo in the night, and for those left behind, the search for peace would go on, slow, fragile, and never quite complete.
In the quiet coastal town of Fairhaven, Maine, where the Atlantic waves whispered secrets to the shore, a strange calm had settled over the community for decades. A place where the fog often swallowed the early mornings whole, and the scent of salt and pine mingled in the air, Fairhaven seemed untouched by time and turmoil. Yet beneath this serene exterior, a mystery lingered, one that would unravel slowly, revealing layers of sorrow, betrayal, and a haunting question that no one could answer. It began in the summer of 1978, with the disappearance of Jonathan Hale. Jonathan was a local fisherman, 32 years old, known for his quiet demeanor and unwavering dedication to his small family. His life was simple but full, mornings spent at sea, afternoons with his wife Claire and their 5-year-old daughter, Emma. To the townsfolk, the Hales were the embodiment of steady, reliable Maine life. But on July 15th, Jonathan didn't return from his early morning trip. Claire's worry grew as hours passed. The sun dipped low behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across the rocky shore, but there was no sign of Jonathan's boat on the horizon. She called the Coast Guard, who launched a search immediately, scanning the choppy waters by boat and helicopter. Yet no trace was found. The official reports listed him as lost at sea, presumed drowned. But for Claire, that explanation never felt complete. Weeks after Jonathan's disappearance, Claire began receiving strange letters, typed messages with no return address, sealed with no signature. They contained cryptic phrases like "the sea keeps its secrets," and "what's lost is not always gone." At first she thought it was a cruel joke, but the letters continued, arriving every few days, growing more personal, revealing details about Jonathan's life that only someone close to him could know. No one else in Fairhaven received such letters. Haunted by these messages, Claire tried to maintain her daily routine, caring for Emma and managing their modest home. But as summer faded into autumn, her grief deepened, and the letters became her only link to a truth she desperately sought. One evening, a visitor arrived, a man calling himself Daniel Pierce, a private investigator from Boston. He claimed he had been hired anonymously to look into Jonathan's disappearance. Daniel's presence was both unsettling and comforting. His calm, methodical approach stood in stark contrast to the growing rumors in town, where some whispered that Jonathan had chosen to vanish, while others hinted at darker forces at play. Together, Claire and Daniel began to peel back the layers of Jonathan's final days. They learned that Jonathan had been involved in something unexpected, a secretive project at the local shipyard, working nights on a vessel no one knew about. His colleagues were tight-lipped, and the shipyard itself was surrounded by a sense of unease, its creaking docks hiding more than just wood and rust. Claire found herself caught between hope and fear, struggling to understand who Jonathan really was and what had happened to him. Meanwhile, the letters grew increasingly urgent. One late October night, Claire opened the latest envelope to find a small faded photograph tucked inside, an image of Jonathan standing beside a man she did not recognize, near a cliff overlooking the sea. Written on the back was a single line: "Look beyond the waves." The cliff was a place Claire had never visited, though she had lived in Fairhaven all her life. That night, sleep eluded her. The sound of crashing waves seemed louder, more insistent. She felt a presence, somewhere between memory and reality, that urged her to seek answers where the sea met the sky. The investigation took them beyond Fairhaven, into forgotten corners of Maine's coastline, through old records, and into encounters with strangers who spoke in riddles about the ocean's hold on those who dared to look too deeply. Jonathan's disappearance was no longer a simple tragedy, but a haunting mystery woven with threads of secrecy, betrayal, and something almost beyond belief. As Claire and Daniel delved deeper, they uncovered whispers of a clandestine experiment involving the shipyard, the government, and unexplainable phenomena, stories that blurred the line between science and the supernatural. But with every answer came new questions, and the sea, with its endless depths and shifting tides, kept its secrets well. Claire's days grew restless as autumn turned to early winter. The chill crept into the corners of the house, where sunlight once lingered, casting long shadows over the worn wooden floors. Emma's laughter, usually a balm to Claire's restless mind, sometimes felt like a fragile thread holding her together, as if the slightest tension could snap it. Daniel was visiting regularly now, often arriving just as dawn broke over the Atlantic, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. Together they pored over every scrap of evidence, every whispered rumor, and every lead that might illuminate the dark path Jonathan had traveled before vanishing. The faded photograph, the one showing Jonathan beside an unfamiliar man near a jagged cliff, became a focal point of their search. Claire had spent hours scanning maps, trying to pinpoint the exact location. Finally, Daniel suggested a place called Devil's Bluff, a treacherous stretch of coastline notorious for its sheer drops and swirling currents. "It's not far," Daniel said, "but the locals don't go there much. There are stories about the place, things best left alone." Claire nodded, though a knot of unease settled in her stomach. Still, she knew she had to see it for herself. The drive to Devil's Bluff was a slow journey through misty forests and narrow roads flanked by dense pines. The air grew colder as they approached, the sky turning a muted slate grey, the Atlantic's restless roar echoing through the valleys. Claire felt an eerie stillness settle over the landscape, as if the cliffs themselves were holding their breath. When they arrived, the bluff rose abruptly from the rocky shore, jagged edges crumbling into the waves below. The wind tugged fiercely at their jackets as they walked the narrow trail along the precipice, the ocean spray stinging Claire's cheeks. Near the cliff's edge, Daniel pointed to a weathered-out crop where the photograph had been taken. There was a rusted metal structure, a corroded ladder leading down toward the sea, long forgotten and half swallowed by the earth. "What do you think this was for?" Claire asked, voice barely above the wind. "No idea. Could be a remnant from the shipyard's secret projects," Daniel replied. They sat quietly for a moment, watching the grey waves crash into the rocks, sending plumes of white spray into the air. Claire's thoughts drifted to Jonathan. What had he been doing here? Who was the man in the photo? And why was this place so deliberately hidden from view? Their return to Fairhaven brought more questions than answers. Over the next days, Daniel worked to contact former employees of the shipyard, some long retired, others reluctant to speak. One name kept surfacing: Victor Crane, a reclusive engineer who had vanished shortly after Jonathan's disappearance. Victor was said to be brilliant, but unstable, obsessed with pushing the limits of maritime technology. Rumors whispered that his projects skirted ethical lines, merging experimental science with government contracts that no one in the town fully understood. Claire and Daniel managed to track Victor to a small cabin deep in the woods outside a neighboring town. The journey there was unsettling, twisting dirt roads disappearing into dense fir trees, silence broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird, or the crunch of their footsteps. When they arrived, the cabin was small and weather-beaten, surrounded by rusting machinery and piles of old blueprints scattered haphazardly. Victor answered the door cautiously, his grey eyes sharp but haunted. He seemed surprised to see them, but allowed them inside without protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and aged paper. Walls were lined with schematics and photographs, many related to ships but some far stranger, images that hinted at underwater experiments and devices that seemed beyond contemporary technology. Victor's story emerged slowly, fragmented and tinged with paranoia. He spoke of a classified project, codenamed Nereid, commissioned during the Cold War era, to develop new forms of marine exploration and defense. Jonathan, Victor revealed, had been brought on board late in the project, working as a liaison between the technical team and the shipyard workers. But Victor hinted at something darker beneath the surface. "There were things they never told us," he said, voice low. Experiments that weren't just about ships or sonar, things that blurred the line between reality and something else. Claire listened intently, the room seeming to close around them as Victor described strange phenomena reported by the crew, unexplained lights beneath the water, equipment failures, even reports of voices carried on the wind. Victor's last words chilled Claire more than the cold Maine air outside. Jonathan wanted out. He saw what was happening, what they were doing, but they wouldn't let him leave. They pressed Victor for details, but he grew evasive, glancing nervously at the door. Eventually, he admitted he feared for his own safety, convinced that powerful forces were determined to keep the project's secrets buried. Claire felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. The simple, familiar life she had known was now tangled in a web of lies and hidden dangers. Back in Fairhaven, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who once greeted Claire with warm smiles now avoided her gaze. Rumors swirled. Some said Jonathan had disappeared by choice. Others whispered of darker fates, but none dared speak openly about the shipyard or the mysterious project. Late one evening, as Claire sat by the window watching the fog roll in from the sea, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find a plain envelope on the doorstep, weighted down with a small stone. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a neat mechanical font. "Stop digging. Some truths drown better beneath the waves." Claire's hands trembled as she held the note, the weight of the warning sinking into her bones. Despite the fear, something deeper drove her onward. The mystery of Jonathan's disappearance was no longer just about loss. It was about uncovering a truth that refused to stay hidden. Daniel offered his quiet support, helping her navigate the growing darkness that seemed to surround the investigation. Together they planned to return to the shipyard, to explore what had been concealed behind the town's quiet facade. But as winter crept closer, bringing with it longer nights and heavier fog, the danger lurking beneath Fairhaven's peaceful surface seemed to tighten its grip. The past and present were converging, and Claire knew that the answers she sought might come at a cost far greater than she had ever imagined. The cold seeped into Claire's bones as winter's grip tightened over Fairhaven. The ocean's roar grew louder in the night, a constant reminder of the town's precarious perch between land and sea. Every morning, she awoke with a restless ache, a mix of hope and dread pulling her toward the truth she was still struggling to grasp. Daniel and Claire met quietly at the edge of the shipyard, one grey afternoon, the sky heavy with low clouds that promised rain. The place was a relic of a bygone era, rusted cranes, decaying docks and hulking skeletons of vessels long abandoned. The air smelled of salt and old iron, the kind of scent that clings stubbornly to skin and memory. They moved cautiously through the yard, their footsteps muffled by years of dust and fallen leaves. Claire's fingers brushed against the cold metal of an old railing as she tried to steady her nerves. The shipyard had once been a hub of life and industry, but now it felt haunted, as if the shadows themselves whispered secrets of the past. Their destination was the old workshop building, a structure half collapsed but still standing defiant against time. It was here, according to Victor's scattered recollections, that the most sensitive parts of Project Nereid had taken shape. The door protested with a creak as Daniel pushed it open, revealing a dim interior thick with dust and silence. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting long beams across forgotten tools and strewn papers. The air was stale, untouched for years, but beneath it lingered something else, a faint metallic tang that Claire couldn't quite place. They began to search methodically, sifting through yellowed blueprints and notebooks, trying to piece together the story that had been buried along with Jonathan. One notebook, bound in cracked leather, caught Claire's eye. Its pages were filled with meticulous notes and sketches, diagrams of underwater devices, strange symbols, and handwritten annotations that hinted at experiments beyond conventional science. Daniel leaned closer, tracing the faded ink. "It looks like they were working on some kind of sonar technology, but there's something else here. References to acoustic resonance and psychic interface." Claire frowned, feeling the weight of the unfamiliar terms. The notes spoke of attempts to harness the ocean's natural frequencies, to create a link between human consciousness and the vast unexplored depths beneath the waves. "It's like they were trying to communicate with something," Claire whispered, a chill running down her spine. As they delved deeper, the workshop yielded more clues.
A series of photographs showing crew members in strange poses, eyes closed, seemingly lost in trance. Some images captured shimmering lights beneath the water's surface, others showed shadowy figures slipping through fog and spray. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Project Nereid was far more than a maritime experiment. It bordered on the occult, an attempt to bridge the known world and an unfathomable other. Claire's mind raced. Jonathan's disappearance suddenly felt less like a tragic accident and more like a carefully orchestrated vanishing, a sacrifice perhaps, or an escape from forces he could no longer control. Daniel found a metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, its lock corroded with age. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, their labels handwritten and faded. "Maybe these hold the key," Daniel said, carefully pulling one out. Back in Claire's small living room, they played the tapes one by one. The crackling static gave way to voices, muffled, urgent, sometimes frightened. Some recordings were technical discussions, but others were more disturbing. Distorted sounds, whispers layered beneath the surface, and the unmistakable tone of someone calling out for help. Claire's heart pounded as a voice, Jonathan's voice, broke through the noise. "Can't hold much longer. They're coming. The water's alive. Must get out." The message ended abruptly, leaving only a haunting silence. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. For the first time, the man she had loved was speaking to her across time, a desperate signal from a hidden world. That night, Claire lay awake, the tape's words echoing in her mind. The sea outside her window seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a vast unknowable presence lurking beneath the surface. She thought of the note left on her doorstep, the warning to stop digging, and wondered who had sent it. Was it someone protecting the truth, or someone trying to bury it forever? The next morning brought a harsh reality. As Claire and Daniel prepared to visit Victor again, a knock came at the door. Claire opened it to find a uniformed officer, his expression solemn. "We need to talk about your investigation," he said quietly. "There have been complaints. People are concerned." The message was clear. The town was watching, and the shadows were closing in. But Claire's resolve only grew stronger. The line between fear and courage blurred as she faced the darkness, knowing that the answers lay somewhere beneath the waves, and in the secrets buried long ago at Devil's Bluff. The ocean was angry that morning. Claire watched from her kitchen window as wind whipped the surface into jagged ridges. Rain lashed sideways, painting the glass in sheets of silver and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a boy clanged mournfully. The sea had a voice today, and it wasn't whispering. She sipped her coffee in silence. The encounter with the officer the day before had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. He hadn't said much, just that the town council had concerns, and that perhaps it would be best to let the past rest. No threats, no raised voices, just a practiced smile behind empty eyes. But it was enough. She knew a warning when she heard one. Daniel arrived just after noon, soaked from head to toe, holding a stack of printed papers wrapped in a plastic bag. His eyes were wild with energy, as though he had seen something that refused to leave his mind. "Claire," he said, pulling off his wet jacket, "you're not going to believe this." He spread the documents across her kitchen table. They were old military records, declassified files Daniel had managed to obtain through contacts in Boston. Most were routine, equipment logs, sonar mapping projects, navigation routes, but one stood out. It was a transcript, labeled simply, USS Kestrel, Dive Log 7, Redacted Protocol. Claire's eyes scanned the typewritten words, her breath catching as she reached the final lines. Dive time, 4:42, contact lost with lead diver, J. Delaney. Final transmission. "It's not the pressure, it's listening. It hears me. I hear it too." Silence. It was Jonathan, not just a name in a file, a man breathing, alive in that moment, and speaking words that made no scientific sense, words steeped in fear. Daniel flipped over another page, revealing a blurry sonar image. It showed something massive beneath the Kestrel, at a depth impossible for human survival, even in advanced diving gear. Not a geological formation, something moving. Claire stared at the shape. It had no name, no sharp edges or clear boundaries, just a vast presence, a smear of darkness in a world already shrouded in silence. "There's more," Daniel said, lowering his voice. The Kestrel was retired just months after this dive. Officially mechanical failure. Unofficially, every crew member was transferred or discharged. Most of them won't talk. Claire leaned back, the pieces assembling in her mind like drifting wreckage forming a whole. Jonathan hadn't died by accident. He hadn't been lost. He had been pulled into something deeper, something the Navy had tried to understand, then quietly abandoned. She looked out the window, the waves still surging. "Do you think he's still alive?" Daniel didn't answer at first. "I think he found something down there that changed him. Whether he's alive in the way we understand it, I don't know." They fell into silence, the storm speaking for them. That evening, Claire made a decision. It was time to return to Devil's Bluff. Not the overlook this time, but the beach below, the place where Jonathan had launched his final dive. The tide would be low by nightfall, the rain had let up, and the wind, for the first time in days, had quieted. She packed a flashlight, a waterproof recorder, and a small vial of Jonathan's cologne, one of the few personal items she still had. Something about bringing a part of him felt right, even if she couldn't explain why. Daniel insisted on coming with her. The descent to the beach was treacherous. The path was narrow, slick with moss and sand, winding its way down the cliffside like a broken staircase. They moved slowly, hands gripping cold rock, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. The beach was almost unrecognizable from above. Jagged rocks jutted out of the sand like the bones of something ancient. Pools of seawater shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting stars behind thin, moving clouds. And in the center of it all, half buried in sand, was what they had come to find. The remains of a launch station. It was small, maybe the size of a trailer, rusted and broken from decades of salt and wind. Its control panel had long since been scavenged or destroyed, but the heavy metal hatch at its base was still intact. Claire knelt beside it, brushing away sand with her hands. The cold bit at her fingertips. She traced the worn emblem stamped into the steel, an anchor entwined with a trident, the old symbol of Project Nereid. Daniel worked at the hatch, prying it open with a crowbar. It gave with a groan that echoed across the empty beach. Beneath was a narrow tunnel, barely lit by Claire's flashlight. A rusted ladder descended into blackness. The air that rose from it was damp and strange, carrying the faint scent of machinery, oil, and something else, something old. "I'll go first," Daniel offered, voice steady. Claire followed. The descent took less than a minute, but it felt like hours. The tunnel led into a small chamber carved from stone, reinforced with steel beams. Old generators lined one wall, their guts ripped out long ago. At the far end, a glass window, cracked but intact, looked out into the ocean, or at least it had once. Now it faced only silt and darkness. There was nothing, or so it seemed. Claire stepped closer to the window, shining her light across its surface. Then she saw it. A smear. No. A fingerprint. Human. Recent. She reached into her coat and removed the vial of cologne. Carefully, she opened it and dabbed a small drop onto the sill below the window. The scent rose slowly, familiar, heartbreaking, and then, something moved outside. Not in the water, in the reflection. Claire spun around, heart racing. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, pale, drenched, eyes wide with recognition and sadness. Jonathan. He didn't speak. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Daniel stood frozen, unsure if what he saw was real, or the trick of pressure and shadow. Jonathan raised one hand, not in warning, in farewell. Then he was gone, vanished into air that hadn't moved. They searched the chamber, every wall, every pipe, every hidden latch, but there was no sign of him. No door he could have entered through. No place to hide, only silence. They returned to the surface in numb quiet, the stars overhead colder than they'd ever seemed. The tide was rising again, claiming the beach grain by grain. Back in the car, Claire pressed the vial of cologne to her chest and closed her eyes. "He was here," she said. "He's still here." Daniel didn't argue. There was nothing left to explain. Some truths are not meant to be unwrapped but simply held, like old photographs, or voices in the dark. In the months that followed, Claire left Fairhaven. The sea never stopped calling, but she stopped answering. She moved inland, taking a position at a small historical society, surrounded by books and memories. Some nights, she would hear the low sound of waves in her dreams. Sometimes she would see a pale figure in the distance, always watching, never approaching. But she felt no fear, only a quiet sorrow, and the certainty that some loves don't end with absence. They simply change shape, like water, always there, even when unseen.
On the southwest side of Chicago, in the waning days of December 1956, the world seemed briefly suspended in time. The city was deep in the grip of winter, its sidewalks buried beneath a dusting of clean, undisturbed snow. In neighborhoods tucked between steepled churches and factories puffing smoke into the sky, families celebrated the season with paper chains, record players spinning holiday tunes, and bowls of steaming stew at the table. Among them were Loretta Grimes and her 7 children. The Grimes family lived a modest life on South Duman Avenue, near the Brighton Park neighborhood, a quiet working-class enclave with narrow brick houses, tree-lined streets, and an old-world sense of order. It was a safe place, or at least it was believed to be. Parents trusted that their children could walk a few blocks alone or run errands at the corner store. The Grimes girls, Barbara, 15, and Patricia, 13, were known in the neighborhood as good kids, quiet, well-behaved, not especially rebellious, but not withdrawn either. They adored Elvis Presley, kept journals filled with neat handwriting and doodles, and liked to sit on the front porch in summer, sipping soda and gossiping about school. Barbara, the older of the two, was thoughtful and shy, a girl who often stayed close to home. Patricia was a little more outgoing, often pulling Barbara into plans she wouldn't have made herself. On the evening of December 28, 1956, the girls asked their mother for permission to go see Love Me Tender, the new Elvis movie playing at the nearby Brighton Theatre. They'd already seen it once, but they were teenagers in the grip of Presley fever, and Loretta, distracted by end-of-year chores, saw no harm in letting them go again. They left the house at around 7:30 p.m., carrying a few coins and wearing matching winter coats. It was only a short walk, less than 2 miles, and the girls had made the trip many times before, but they would never come home. Loretta began to worry when midnight passed without word from her daughters. She paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes, then finally called neighbors and friends. No one had seen the girls. By early morning, panic had begun to bloom in her chest. She called the police. In those early hours, no one expected the tragedy that would unfold. The prevailing belief, even among investigators, was that the girls had simply run away. Maybe they'd taken a bus to Nashville to see Elvis in person. Maybe they were staying with friends and would turn up once the excitement wore off. But Loretta knew her daughters. They didn't run. They didn't lie. Something was wrong. In the following days, the search for Barbara and Patricia Grimes would become one of the largest missing persons investigations in the history of Chicago at the time. It would involve thousands of people, police, volunteers, FBI agents, and even psychics. Tips would pour in from across the country. Elvis himself would make a public plea, urging the girls to return home. And through it all, the city would wait, breath held, as winter wore on, and hope grew thinner. 17 days later, on January 22, 1957, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott spotted something unusual while driving down a quiet stretch of German Church Road in unincorporated Willow Springs, a sparsely populated area about 15 miles southwest of the city. He thought at first that it was a pair of mannequins discarded in the snow. He stopped to take a closer look. There, partially hidden in a roadside ditch just beyond an embankment, lay the bodies of 2 girls, nude, pale, and eerily undisturbed, as though placed there gently. Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been found. The scene was strange. The girls' bodies lay side by side, facing each other. No attempt had been made to bury them. There were no signs of a struggle in the area, no visible drag marks or footprints that the investigators could find, though it had snowed in the days leading up to the discovery. Their clothing was missing. Their skin showed signs of minor abrasions, but little overt trauma. No obvious gunshots, no deep stab wounds, just silence. The coroner's report would only deepen the mystery. Barbara had sustained some bruising around her face, and Patricia had a puncture wound to her chest that may have been inflicted after death. Traces of what appeared to be coal dust were found on their bodies, suggesting they had been stored somewhere before being dumped. But cause of death, the coroner couldn't say. After 2 autopsies, the best they could offer was exposure to the elements, but that didn't add up. The night the girls went missing, the temperatures had dropped only slightly below freezing, and if they had been dumped soon after death, why hadn't their bodies frozen solid? Why were they found nearly 3 weeks later, in such a relatively preserved state? Where had they been in the meantime? The mystery was compounded by the flood of tips and sightings that had been reported between the day the girls vanished and the day they were found. They had supposedly been seen at an ice cream parlor on Archer Avenue. A bus driver claimed they boarded a bus headed west. A clerk in Nashville swore she'd seen them asking about directions to Graceland. Multiple teenagers reported seeing them in the days after the disappearance, always together, always calm. Were these cases of mistaken identity, or had the girls truly been held somewhere, alive, before being discarded like trash? The police focused their attention on a 21-year-old man named Edward Benny Bedwell, a drifter from Tennessee, who bore a slight resemblance to Elvis and had been working in the area. Bedwell had a low IQ, a drinking problem, and a reputation for telling tall tales. Under intense questioning, he confessed to spending several days with the girls in a basement apartment, claiming that he and a friend had beaten them to death when they refused sexual advances. But the details didn't align. The autopsy showed no evidence of prolonged captivity or blunt force trauma. Witnesses placed Bedwell miles away on the night in question. Eventually, the confession was thrown out, deemed coerced, and Bedwell was released. He would later die of natural causes, still insisting he had nothing to do with the crime. With Bedwell cleared, the case went cold. Decades passed, leads faded, theories multiplied. Some believed the killer was a member of the police. Others pointed to organized crime, suggesting the girls had stumbled into something they shouldn't have seen. There were whispers of satanic cults, of local factory workers with dark pasts, of a mysterious man in a green car who had been seen following the girls. But no arrests were made. Loretta Grimes never stopped fighting. Until her death in 1989, she kept a candle in the window. She answered every call, opened every letter, clung to every rumor. She believed the truth was still out there, buried beneath years of silence and error. And somewhere, perhaps even now, the answer lies waiting, like the bodies of her daughters once did, in the quiet, untouched corners of a place that had seemed for so long safe. The grief that settled over the Grimes family home was the kind that made time feel brittle and airless. After the discovery of Barbara and Patricia's bodies, the house on South Damen Avenue seemed to fall under a strange quiet. Neighbors came by in silent processions, dropping off casseroles and offering condolences in whispers, as if raising their voices might disturb something fragile and sacred that now lingered in the rooms where the girls had once played. Loretta Grimes, the girls' mother, rarely left the house. She took to sitting near the front window, watching the street, scanning the sidewalks as if her daughters might still come walking home. Her sons, some still school-aged, some already young men, did their best to fill the hollow spaces left behind. But grief had a way of silencing even the most familiar routines. Newspapers printed photographs of the Grimes sisters almost daily for weeks. They showed them smiling in school portraits, their hair neatly parted, their eyes hopeful and bright. But these weren't just images. To the city, Barbara and Patricia had become symbols of innocence, stolen not just from their family, but from the community at large. The police, under intense public scrutiny, scrambled to keep the case alive. Dozens of detectives were reassigned to work the investigation full-time. Thousands of interviews were conducted. The FBI assisted with profiling, and tips continued to pour in from across Illinois and even other states. But leads turned to dead ends with numbing frequency. Every time a promising name surfaced, it seemed to fall apart under the weight of its own contradictions. Witnesses recanted, alibis held up. Forensic evidence, still limited in the 1950s, yielded almost nothing. No fingerprints, no hair fibers, no blood.
No definitive proof of what had happened between December 28, 1956, and January 22, 1957. The one thread investigators continued to tug on, despite its frayed edges, was the notion that the girls had been seen alive after they were presumed dead. Over 160 individual reports described sightings of the sisters in various places across Chicago and beyond. Some claimed to have served them at diners, others saw them walking hand in hand down busy streets. One woman, a department store clerk, swore she had helped them try on lipstick. Police initially dismissed these as well-intentioned mistakes, but a few accounts were hard to ignore. One witness, a classmate from school, claimed she had spoken directly to Barbara on the street nearly a week after the girls disappeared. She was shaken, not confident, and said the girls appeared dazed, as if something was wrong. It begged the question, could they have been held somewhere? But if so, by whom? And why return them, lifeless, to an open ditch? Amid the uncertainty, a small handful of suspects began to take shape in the shadows of the case, forming a dark constellation of possibilities. One of them was a man named Max Fleeg, a 17-year-old from the neighborhood. Fleeg had a history of petty theft and had once been caught peeping through windows. When brought in for questioning, he failed a polygraph. But under Illinois law at the time, statements made by minors without a parent or attorney present were inadmissible. Even more frustrating for detectives, Fleeg never confessed to anything substantial, only admitted that he had dark thoughts sometimes. Without any physical evidence, he was quietly released. Years later, a retired officer would say, off the record, that he believed Fleeg was the one, but there was never enough to prove it. Another lead emerged in the form of Walter Kranz, a 53-year-old self-described spiritualist who had contacted police claiming to have experienced a vision. He told investigators that he had seen the girls' bodies in a remote area near German Church Road, exactly where they were found days later. Kranz said he hadn't told anyone because he was afraid of being labeled a crank. He only came forward after the discovery. How had he known? Kranz claimed it was a psychic impression. He said he had nothing to do with the girls' disappearance or deaths. Still, the police were suspicious. He was interrogated multiple times and eventually released without charge. His alibi checked out. His vision, for all its eerie accuracy, didn't amount to proof. These strange, disjointed details only made the case more haunting. Each time a clue surfaced, it seemed to dissolve upon contact with daylight. The crime had an almost spectral quality, like a half-remembered dream that couldn't quite be stitched back together. Loretta never wavered in her belief that someone knew more than they were saying. She wrote letters to editors. She called radio shows. She stood outside the theater, where her daughters had last been seen, and passed out flyers, even when others told her it was no use. Her voice was steady and quiet, not hysterical, but it carried a power that drew people to her. She didn't want revenge. She wanted answers. At one point, the police brought in a known sexual predator who had previously confessed to harming young girls. He claimed to have picked the sisters up on 35th Street and driven them out of the city, but within hours, he retracted his story. Polygraphs were inconclusive. Investigators, wary of another Bedwell situation, dropped the lead. The Grimes sisters' case began to take on a new kind of weight. No longer just an active investigation, it became a symbol of loss, a reminder that even in safe neighborhoods, even in quiet homes with loving families, tragedy could sneak in without warning. The landscape around Willow Springs changed slowly over time. Trees grew taller, new roads were built, people stopped talking about the Grimes case, unless prompted by anniversaries or retrospectives. Yet there were still some who couldn't let it go. Former detectives kept manila folders in filing cabinets. Long after retirement, journalists would revisit the story in hushed tones, finding only echoes. One of the most haunting aspects of the case remained its lack of closure. In an era before DNA testing, before modern forensic mapping, cases like these often hinged on confession or eyewitness testimony. Neither would come in this case. Years later, retired Cook County Sheriff's investigator Raymond Johnson would try to rekindle public interest. He had a suspect in mind, Charles Melquist, a young man who had once been convicted in the 1958 murder of Bonnie Lee Scott, a case with eerie similarities to the Grimes sisters' deaths. Melquist had never been charged in connection with the Grimes case, but Johnson believed there were connections. His theory was compelling, but it came decades too late. Melquist died in 2010. Loretta passed away in 1989, and with them perhaps went the last chance at resolution. But the neighborhood never truly forgot. Sometimes, on quiet nights, older residents would glance down the street where Barbara and Patricia used to walk. They'd remember the way the girls would sing along with Elvis records, the way Barbara's hair caught the light, how Patricia always wore her scarf just a little too loose, and they'd wonder, where had the girls gone during those missing weeks? Who had they trusted? Who had betrayed that trust? And above all, why? Years passed, but the silence surrounding Barbara and Patricia Grimes never truly settled. It was not a peaceful silence, the kind that follows acceptance or understanding. This was something heavier, more suffocating, a silence that pressed down on the city, like low cloud cover, dampening everything it touched. Every so often, something would disturb it, a newspaper article commemorating the anniversary of their disappearance, or a retired officer speaking out with a new theory. But the case never moved forward. It remained frozen in the long shadow of its own mystery. In the years following the murders, Chicago's neighborhoods changed. The tidy post-war optimism of the 1950s gave way to the uncertainty of the 1960s. Families moved away. Children who had once played hopscotch on cracked sidewalks now raised their own families in distant suburbs. But the Grimes case endured in collective memory, an unsolved ache, an old photograph left in a kitchen drawer. For Loretta Grimes, there was no closure. She refused to move. The family's home remained exactly as it had been in 1956. The curtains were still the same pale blue. The living room still held framed photos of Barbara and Patricia, smiling in dresses that had gone out of style decades earlier. It wasn't nostalgia. It was preservation. A mother, unwilling to erase her daughter's last footprints. Occasionally, reporters would reach out to her for comment, anniversary pieces, true crime retrospectives, local interest stories. She would always answer the same way, softly, clearly, and without bitterness. "I know someone knows what happened," she once said in a 1975 interview. "They just never had the decency to come forward." In the years following the girls' deaths, there were a handful of new suspects, none of them ever charged. Theories bloomed and withered like the wildflowers near the ditch on German Church Road, but none ever grew roots deep enough to hold. One of the most persistent theories involved a young man named Charles Melquist. In 1958, nearly 2 years after the Grimes murders, Melquist was arrested for the brutal killing of 15-year-old Bonnie Lee Scott. Bonnie's body had been found in a forest preserve, her remains mutilated in a way that bore similarities to what had happened to Barbara and Patricia. Her last known location, a bus stop, heading to a movie theater. Melquist was eventually convicted for Bonnie's murder and sentenced to 99 years in prison. He served less than 12. Released in 1972, he changed his name and disappeared into civilian life. Though he was never formally charged with the Grimes case, many investigators and several journalists believed the similarities were more than coincidence. The timing, the victim profiles, the geographic overlap, but without a confession or physical evidence, it remained speculation. One retired detective, Raymond Johnson, pursued the Melquist theory well into the 2000s. He even interviewed Melquist on the phone shortly before his death in 2010. Johnson later described the man's demeanor as slippery and deliberate. He never admitted to anything, but when asked directly about the Grimes sisters, he reportedly paused, then changed the subject. That pause became the focus of many late-night conversations in the city's south side. The question remained, if it was Melquist, why hadn't he been stopped earlier? And if it wasn't, then who? The silence surrounding the case had taken on an almost spiritual quality. In neighborhoods where faith played a daily role in people's lives, prayers were still occasionally offered in the names of Barbara and Patricia. At St. Maurice Catholic Church, where the Grimes family once attended Mass. Older parishioners remembered the girls with a kind of sacred sorrow. Each year, on December 28th, candles were lit in the sanctuary without announcement or ceremony, just light and darkness, for two daughters who never came home. The Grimes case had also left a lasting imprint on Chicago law enforcement. It changed the way missing children cases were handled. Prior to 1956, police often waited 24 hours before treating a disappearance as a potential abduction. After the Grimes tragedy, the city shortened that window. The case also sparked early conversations about coordinated databases for missing youth, a system that wouldn't come to full fruition until decades later. In quiet ways, Barbara and Patricia had shaped the future, even as their own had been taken from them. But within the family, the wound never healed. Loretta eventually passed away in 1989, never having learned the truth. Her sons went on to live ordinary lives, working, raising families, moving away from the house on Damen Avenue, but none of them ever forgot. In interviews, they would speak of their sisters not as myths or victims, but as real people. Barbara loved music, and talked too fast when she was excited. Patricia liked sewing, and had a shy smile she gave only when she was truly happy. These details, though small, gave dimension to their memory. They weren't just part of a headline, they had been alive. It's easy in stories like these to reduce the victims to symbols: innocence, tragedy, loss. But Barbara and Patricia were more than that. They were daughters and sisters and friends. They were girls who bought movie tickets with babysitting money, who combed their hair before leaving the house, who held hands while walking down snow-dusted sidewalks. And they were loved. The landscape of Willow Springs, where their bodies had been found, slowly changed. Developers built a few homes near the old orchard. New residents, unaware of the land's history, planted rose bushes and raised fences. But some locals still remembered. If you asked the right person, they could take you to the exact spot, now grown over with thistle and sumac, where the girls had been left. Sometimes, teenagers dared each other to visit the site at night. They called it haunted, said they'd seen shadows move between the trees. Most didn't believe in ghosts, but something about the place made them speak in hushed tones. Maybe it wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. Maybe it was just heavy with memory. The weight of unanswered questions has a way of lingering in places like that. And what of the man, or men responsible? Did he live out his life unnoticed? Did he carry guilt? Or did he forget? Did he ever return to the orchard in Willow Springs, looking over his shoulder as leaves crunched underfoot? Or did he simply disappear into the vast anonymity of the city? There are stories, unconfirmed, that someone once confessed on his deathbed, a brief mumbled admission made to a priest or a nurse too vague to act on. These stories come and go, like rumors carried on wind, but they never seem to settle, never become fact. Instead, we're left with the same image: two sisters, full of light, vanishing on a winter night, their laughter swallowed by the hum of traffic, their footprints lost in snow. The final hours of their lives remain a blank space, and in that space, we project everything we cannot explain: fear, grief, outrage, hope. We try to understand something that cannot be understood. But perhaps the truest way to remember Barbara and Patricia Grimes is not through the horror of their end, but through the gentle, ordinary moments they shared before it. The music they loved, the warmth of their home, the sound of their voices, still echoing, somehow through the quiet. Time softens many things, the rough edges of grief, the sharp clarity of memories, even the fury of injustice can blur with the years. But for some stories, like the one that unfolded in the winter of 1956, time only deepens the shadows. The longer a mystery lingers, the more it feels like a haunting. The case of Barbara and Patricia Grimes became one such haunting, a quiet one, never screaming for attention, but always present in the periphery of Chicago's memory. For decades, the case sat unsolved in the archives of the Cook County Sheriff's Office. The original detectives retired or passed away. Boxes of paper grew brittle with age. Tape recordings, if they existed, were likely degraded. And yet every so often, A spark would flicker, someone would reach into the past, hoping to light a path through the darkness. In the early 2000s, a retired West Chicago police officer named Raymond Johnson decided to take another look. He had read about the Grimes case as a boy, and it had stayed with him into adulthood. After retiring, he began researching the story as a personal project. What began as curiosity evolved into an obsession. Johnson began collecting everything he could find: newspaper clippings, court records, transcripts of interviews. He tracked down people who had lived in the neighborhood in the 1950s, visited the sites connected to the case, and cross-referenced timelines that had long been dismissed. What he found was a case full of contradictions, forgotten leads, and frustrating dead ends. But he also found something else. As he dug deeper, Johnson grew more and more convinced that Charles Melquist, the man convicted in the Bonnie Scott case, was the most likely suspect in the Grimes murders as well. Melquist had lived just miles from where the girls' bodies were discovered. His method of killing Bonnie had disturbing similarities to the Grimes case: strangulation without clear sexual assault, a staged body in a remote area, and the strange absence of defensive wounds. Most chilling of all, Bonnie's murder occurred less than 2 years after the Grimes sisters were found. Johnson also noted the eerie fact that after Melquist was arrested in 1958, there were no more similar cases in the area. It was as if the pattern had simply stopped. But Melquist was never charged in the Grimes case. At the time of his arrest, authorities had already failed to pin the Grimes case on him despite their suspicions. Without concrete evidence, a confession, a witness or physical proof, they were left with only instinct and theory. Melquist himself had always denied involvement. When questioned in the 1980s by reporters, he remained evasive but calm. "That was a long time ago," he said once in a brief phone interview. "I've moved on with my life. I'm not that person anymore." But even if Melquist had been guilty, the legal system had already done what it could. He had served time, albeit briefly, and lived the remainder of his life in relative obscurity. He died in 2010, never having admitted to anything beyond the crime for which he was convicted. And so the Grimes case remained where it had always been, unanswered. Still, there were moments of grace in the aftermath. In 2013, a memorial bench was installed in McKinley Park, near where the Grimes sisters had often walked and played as children. The plaque reads simply, "In memory of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, forever young, forever loved." Locals donated money for the installation, and at the quiet dedication, several surviving classmates of the girls stood silently with bowed heads. A breeze moved through the trees. The past brushed against the present. Barbara would have been 73 that year. Patricia, 71. It's difficult to imagine what their lives might have looked like. Would they have had families, careers? Would they have stayed in Chicago, or moved to the suburbs like so many others? Would they have grown old watching their grandchildren play in the same park where they once held hands and skipped toward the theater? We don't get to know. Instead, their story ended abruptly, frozen in time. Their faces remain young in every photo, their dresses neat, their expressions hopeful. They exist in memory, not in motion. The Grimes case is often cited as one of the earliest instances of media saturation surrounding a missing child case. In that sense, it became a cultural inflection point. The community's response, the search parties, the donations, the press conferences, paved the way for modern approaches to child abduction cases. Today, organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children owe part of their model to what Chicago learned in those cold, helpless days of 1956. And yet, for all the procedural changes and cultural lessons, the emotional core of the case remains heartbreakingly simple. Two girls went to see a movie and never came home. They were good girls, kind, responsible. They weren't running away, they weren't rebelling, they were simply doing what kids did, looking for a bit of fun on a winter night. That ordinariness makes their story all the more painful. There was no reason for it, no explanation that could ever make sense of what happened next. That's the cruelest part of crimes like this. Not just the act itself, but the silence that follows, the hollow space where justice should be, the unending questions that slowly eat away at those left behind. Over the years, other suspects were floated, drifters, ex-cons, local eccentrics. Some confessions were obtained under duress, others simply didn't match the timeline. Detectives tried, truly tried, but were chasing something invisible, and with every year that passed, the case became harder to touch, fragile like old parchment, too easy to tear. Loretta Grimes, steadfast until the end, had always insisted that the truth would come out. She believed someone had seen something, someone knew. It wasn't just my girls who were taken, she once said, it was everyone who loved them. We all lost something that night, and maybe that's the most enduring part of the story, not just the mystery, but the love. A city loved those girls, their family, their community, even strangers drawn to their story decades later. They all carried a piece of the loss, and still do. To this day, true crime enthusiasts revisit the Grimes case with respectful curiosity. Podcasts, articles, and documentaries try to retell the story, sometimes with new information, sometimes with speculation, but the best of them do something else entirely. They remember the girls as they were, not as a cold case, not as statistics, but as sisters who laughed and whispered, and walked arm in arm down a city street. In the stillness of winter, when snow falls quiet over Chicago, the story returns, not loudly, just a whisper. Two girls, a theater, a long walk home, and a mystery that never let go.